Story 1. The Kept. Before we start tonight, I want to tell you something about Hardin County, Mississippi. The Vassar family has worked the same 400 acres there since before the county had a name. Every farmer in that county will tell you the same thing. In a bad year, when the wells run dry and the crops fail and the sky goes white with heat, the Vassar fields are always full. Always green, always heavy. Nobody asks why anymore. They stopped asking a long time ago. A nurse named June Calloway moved into the Vassar farmhouse in September because the rent was right and she needed something quieter than Memphis. She found a house full of photographs. Every photograph showed the same woman. And then she opened a kitchen drawer and found a photograph of herself, taken decades before she was born. This is her account. She's writing it from a hospital in Memphis. Make of that what you will. I want to be precise about what I knew before I arrived, because the sequence of knowing matters, and I have gone over it enough times that I trust my account of it. I knew that Hardin County was a 30-minute drive south of Clarksdale on a state road that the GPS treated as optional. I knew that the Vassar farm was 400 acres of soybeans and cotton on the west side of the county, with a farmhouse that a real estate listing had described as a historic Delta property with original architectural features and substantial acreage, offered as part of an estate sale following the death of the previous tenant. I knew that the rent was $700 a month for a 3-bedroom house with a working kitchen and a covered porch facing west toward the fields, which was $800 less per month than anything comparable in Memphis, where I had been living since finishing my nursing degree, and where I had been spending more of my income on rent than the math of my life could sustain indefinitely. I knew that the family who owned the property was named Vassar, that they had been in Hardin County for as long as the county records went back, and that the family's current representative, a man named Cecil Vassar, whose voice on the phone had the specific flatness of someone delivering information they have delivered many times before, had told me the house was mine if I wanted it, that the farm ran itself and would not require anything of me, that the only condition of the tenancy was that I not go into the field at night. I had laughed at this. I told him I had no interest in fields at night. He said good and gave me the move-in date, and that was the extent of our conversation about conditions. I did not think about the condition again until the 3rd week. My name is June Calloway. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Tupelo, which is 4 hours east and a different Mississippi entirely, the hill country rather than the Delta, a landscape of red clay and pine rather than black soil and cottonwood. I had come to the Delta by way of Memphis and a nursing position at the county hospital in Clarksdale that I had taken because the offer had come when I needed an offer, because the burnout of 3 years in a Memphis ICU had left me wanting something with more air around it, more quiet, more the specific relief of a life that was not organized around emergency. The farmhouse was everything the listing had said and several things it had not. It was large for one person. The rooms high-ceilinged and cool in the way of old southern houses built before air conditioning, designed to move air rather than contain it. The kitchen had been updated sometime in the 90s, but retained the bones of the original, a long room with eastern light in the mornings and a table that had absorbed enough years of use to have stopped being furniture and become geography. The covered porch faced west across the field, and in the late afternoon the light came off the soybean crop in a way that was difficult not to find beautiful. The flat delta light particular to that hour, horizontal and gold, turning the field into something that did not look entirely like agriculture, and did not look entirely like anything else. I unpacked over 2 days in September. My furniture was sparse. I had not accumulated much in 3 years of renting in Memphis, and the house received it with the patient tolerance of a space that has held many people's belongings and will hold many more. I arranged things, hung 2 pictures, made the kitchen mine with the specific small acts of territoriality that turn a place you are paying for into a place you inhabit. I drove to the Clarksdale Kroger for groceries. I found the nearest gas station, the nearest pharmacy, the route to the hospital. I learned the county's geography the way you learn a new place, by driving it until it stops feeling foreign. On the fourth day, I noticed the photographs, not for the first time. I had registered them on arrival, in the way you register any decorative element in a furnished space you are renting, noting their presence without attending to their content. They were throughout the house, framed photographs on the walls of the hallway, on the mantelpiece in the sitting room, on the narrow shelf that ran the length of the upstairs landing. I had assumed, on arrival, that the family had left behind their own photographs, which was a common enough occurrence in estate rentals, and had not examined them carefully. On the fourth day, in the late afternoon when the western light was doing its particular work through the porch windows and I had come inside to start dinner, I looked at the photograph on the wall beside the kitchen doorway. It showed a woman, dark hair, pale skin for the Delta, a particular set to her chin that I registered as confidence or stubbornness, or the specific expression of someone who has been photographed often enough to have settled into a relationship with the camera. The photograph was old. The format and the quality placed it somewhere in the mid-20th century, the 50s or 60s, and the woman was young, perhaps mid-20s, looking directly at the lens with that tilted chin. I went to the sitting room. The photograph on the mantelpiece showed a different woman, different clothing, different hairstyle, a different decade, but the same face, the same chin, the same arrangement of features, the same dark hair and pale complexion. I went to the hallway. 5 photographs spanning what appeared to be several decades, showing women in the fashion and hairstyle of their respective periods, all with the same face. I went upstairs to the landing shelf. 7 more photographs, older than the ones below, some in the sepia-toned format of the early 20th century, one in the formal rigidity of what might have been the 1890s. The faces were the same face. I stood on the landing with the September light coming through the window at the end of the hall and looked at the photographs and felt the specific discomfort of a person who has noticed something. That does not resolve into a comfortable explanation. The charitable reading, the most immediately available reading, was that this was one family, that these women were related across several generations, that the family resemblance was strong, and the photographs happened to capture it at similar angles. Some families do look that much alike. Some family features persist across generations with that kind of fidelity. The uncharitable reading, which I set aside because I had just unpacked 2 boxes and hung 2 pictures and driven the county roads for 4 days and signed a 12-month lease, was that the resemblance was too precise. That what I was looking at was not a strong family resemblance, but the same face across a century, unchanged in its essential proportions, appearing in photograph after photograph the way the same note appears in different keys, recognizable, not because it is repeated, but because it is the same. I made dinner. I ate on the porch, watching the field go from gold to shadow in the Delta dusk. The soybeans were heavy on their stalks, a crop that looked, in the failing light, almost excessively, too abundant, too heavy, the field leaning slightly under the weight of what it was producing. I thought about the condition Cecil Vassar had mentioned on the phone. The field at night. Then I thought about something else, which was the smell. I had registered it on arrival, dismissed it as the ordinary smell of a working agricultural property, and not returned to it consciously. Now, in the cooling September evening with the field going dark in front of me, it arrived more distinctly. The sweetness of the soybeans, yes, and beneath that, the turned earth smell of a Delta field in late summer, and beneath that, something else. Not a decay smell exactly, but something adjacent to decay. The smell of something organic in a slow process, something that had been in process for a long time, something that the field was either producing or consuming, and that the wind carried toward the house in a way that suggested it was coming from the field's center rather than its edges. I told myself it was the soil. The Delta's black soil had its own smell, richer and darker than the hill country clay I had grown up with, a smell that could be disconcerting if you were not accustomed to it. I went inside. I washed my dishes and checked my phone and read for an hour and went to bed. From the bedroom window, I could see the field. The soybeans were silver in the moonlight, the rows running straight west from the house toward a darkness at the field center that I could not account for, a specific density of shadow that was different from the ordinary shadow of a field at night, a darkness that had a quality of presence rather than mere absence of light. I did not go to the field. I watched the darkness at the field center for what might have been 10 minutes, and then closed the curtain and went to sleep. And in the morning everything was ordinary. The field green and ordinary in the September light, the house ordinary around me. The smell that was not quite soil and not quite anything else retreated to the threshold of perception where I could choose not to notice it. I chose not to notice it for another week. Then one morning I opened the center drawer of the kitchen desk, looking for a pin, and found a photograph I had not seen before. Smaller than the others, unframed, tucked beneath a stack of utility company pamphlets as though it had been placed there deliberately and forgotten, or placed there deliberately and left. The woman in the photograph had my face, not similar to my face, not approximately my face, the same jaw, the same brow, the same distance between the eyes, the specific shape of the nose that I had inherited from my mother and that I had spent my adolescence mildly resenting and had eventually accepted. The woman in the photograph was not me. The photograph was decades old, at minimum, and I was looking at a stranger. But the face looking back at me from the small, unframed print was the face I saw every morning in the bathroom mirror. I stood in the kitchen with the photograph in my hand and felt the floor do something it should not do, which was to seem less certain than it had been. I put the photograph in the kitchen drawer where I had found it, closed the drawer and went to work. I drove the 30 minutes to Clarksdale with the radio on and the windows down in the September Delta morning, doing what September Delta mornings do, which is to be warm and bright and entirely indifferent to the people moving through them. I thought about the photograph for the entire drive, and arrived at the hospital and put it somewhere I could function from, and did my shift and drove home and stood in the kitchen and opened the drawer again. The photograph was still there, my face was still in it, and outside, through the window over the sink, the Vassar field was still doing whatever it was doing in the center of itself, where the shadow gathered at night and the smell came from. The photograph stayed in the drawer for 4 days before I took it out and looked at it properly. I am a nurse. I have been a nurse for 7 years, and before that a nursing student for 4, and the thing that nursing does to a person, the thing I had not understood when I chose the profession and had come to understand gradually through the specific education of difficult shifts, is that it trains you to manage the thing you are feeling while you continue doing what needs to be done. This is not numbness, which is a different and less functional state. It is the practiced deferral of the interior experience to a time when the practical demands of the present have been met. I had gotten very good at this in the Memphis ICU, where the practical demands were urgent and continuous, and the interior experience, if attended to immediately, would have made the work impossible. I was applying this skill to the photograph in the drawer. I was not ready to attend to what the photograph meant, so I was not attending to it yet. What I was attending to, because it was more immediately manageable, was the house. The house had things in it that a rented property should not have, not furniture. The listing had specified a furnished rental, and the furniture was explained. The photographs on the walls were explained, or I was explaining them as the remnants of the previous occupants' decorating choices left behind during the estate transition. What the house had that I could not explain by the furnished rental framework was a quality of arrangement. The specific positions of objects on shelves and in drawers and on the mantelpiece had the character of intentional placement rather than the character of accumulated habit. Things were where they were for a reason, and the reason felt considered. Felt like someone had thought about where these objects needed to be and had placed them there with care. The photographs in particular were hung at a consistent height throughout the house, at a consistent angle in frames of consistent style, despite their apparent different ages. Someone had standardized the display. Someone had taken photographs from different decades, different sizes, different formats, and reframed them in matching dark wood frames and hung them at the same height on every accessible wall. This was not the behavior of an estate left untouched at the tenant's death. This was curation. I drove to the Clarksdale County Recorder's office on my second day off, which was a Friday in the third week of September. I told the clerk I was looking for property records for the Vassar farm in Hardin County. She was helpful in the way of small county government clerks who rarely receive requests for historical property records and find them a welcome variation in the week's routine. She brought me 3 folders and left me at the research table. The property had been in the Vassar family since 1841, when a man named Calhoun Vassar had registered the original land grant. The subsequent records showed the farm passing through male Vassars, Calhoun to his son Edwin to his son James, James to his son Harlow, Harlow to his son Leland, Leland to his son Cecil, in an unbroken line of patrilineal inheritance across 180 years. The acreage had remained almost exactly constant throughout, between 380 and 420 acres. The minor variations explainable by survey corrections and minor boundary adjustments. What the records also showed in the census data and the associated household documentation was a consistent anomaly in the female occupants of the property. Every decade's census going back to 1850 listed a female resident of the Vassar household who was not a blood relative, listed as tenant or boarder, or, in the earlier records, the category that the census used before it had a better word for arrangements, it did not fully understand. The names changed every decade or two. The descriptions and the brief notations of census takers who recorded only what they saw were consistent: dark hair, pale complexion, in apparent good health, in apparent good health. The phrase appeared in multiple decades' records in the handwriting of different census enumerators, as though it were being noted against some expectation to the contrary. I photographed the relevant pages and thanked the clerk and drove back to the farmhouse through the Hardin County afternoon, which was the specific gold of a Delta September afternoon that I was beginning to understand as the county's default light, its baseline, the color it returned to when nothing else was asking for attention. The farmhouse was empty and cool when I arrived. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the photographs on the hallway wall, and then went to the drawer and took out the small, unframed print and brought it to the kitchen table under the overhead light. The woman in the photograph was approximately my age. I could not date the photograph precisely, somewhere between 1940 and 1960 based on the format. But the woman's apparent age was mid-20s to early 30s, which was where I was. She was wearing a dress I could not identify by period. Her hair was dark and pulled back, which was my hair's natural tendency that I'd been fighting with various products since college. Her eyes, in the black and white print, appeared light, gray or green, impossible to determine. My eyes were gray-green. Her chin had the specific tilt I had been looking at in the other photographs throughout the house. My chin, in photographs I did not like, did the same thing. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in a handwriting I did not recognize. Small, precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to keeping records, a name and 2 dates, not 1 date. 2. The name was Alma. The first date was 1943. The second date was blank, not absent. The space was there. The format suggested a second date was expected, but the space had been left empty, as though the person writing had not yet known what to put there or had decided not to put anything. I set the photograph down on the kitchen table. Outside, the field was doing what the field did in the late afternoon, catching the light, looking abundant, looking like the kind of land that justifies itself by what it produces. The soybeans were heavy, the rows were straight, The center of the field, where the shadow gathered at night and the smell was strongest, was not visible from the kitchen window at this angle, which was an absence I had begun to notice the way you notice any gap and what you can see from a position you have been occupying long enough to know its limits. I looked up Vassar in the county newspaper archives that evening on my laptop. The Hardin County Courier had been publishing since 1912, and portions of it had been digitized by a historical society project. I searched for Vassar and found the expected results: farm reports, agricultural competition awards, the brief social notices of a prominent county family across several decades. I found one other thing, a notice from 1943. 4 sentences, the kind of notice that a small county paper ran when a fact needed to be recorded and no one wanted to spend more words on it than required. A woman named Alma Greer, of no fixed county address, had taken up residence at the Vassar farm as a tenant, welcomed by the family. She was described as a young woman of good character recently arrived from out of county. No subsequent notice. No further mention of Alma Greer in any edition I could access. No mention of her leaving. I sat with my laptop and the farmhouse quiet around me and thought about a woman who had arrived in Hardin County in 1943 and been noticed by the county paper, and then stopped being noticed, who had a name and 2 dates on the back of a photograph, and only the first date filled in, who had the same face as every other woman displayed in this house across 180 years of carefully curated darkwood frames. The smell was stronger that evening. I noticed it through the screen door of the porch when I went to close it before bed. The sweetness with the decay underneath, coming from the center of the field in the still night air, more present than it had been in the past week, as though something in the field was moving closer to a threshold. I told myself it was a soybean harvest, that the smell intensified as the crop dried, that I was a hill country girl unfamiliar with the Delta's agricultural rhythms, and was reading meaning into a seasonal process that the county's farmers understood without comment. I closed the screen door and locked it and went to bed. In the morning I called Cecil Vassar. His voice on the phone was the same as it had been in our initial conversation, flat, measured, the voice of a man who deploys words with the economy of someone who has decided most of them are unnecessary. I said I had some questions about the property. He said, "What kind of questions?" I said I had found a photograph in the kitchen drawer, a photograph of a woman named Alma, and I wondered if he could tell me who she was. The silence that followed was brief, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. But it had a quality that a silence of that length in ordinary conversation does not have. It had the quality of a person placing something carefully before responding. He said Alma had been a tenant of the property many years ago. He said the photograph must have been overlooked during the estate transition. He said he apologized for any confusion and would arrange to have it collected. I said that was all right. I was just curious about the history of the place. He said the property had a long history. He said the Vassar family valued the continuity of it. I asked about the other photographs, the ones throughout the house. I said I had noticed they all appeared to show women with similar features, and I was curious about the family history. Another brief silence. Then he said those were family portraits. He said the Vassar women had always shared certain features. He said it was a strong family line. I said I noticed the woman in the kitchen drawer photograph seemed to have features similar to mine. The silence this time was longer. 4 seconds, perhaps 5. When he spoke again, his voice had not changed in register. Still flat, still measured. But something in it had shifted. The way the quality of air shifts in a room when someone opens a window you did not know was there. He said that was an interesting observation. He said the farm had always attracted the right tenants. He said the land had a way of finding the people who suited it. I thanked him and ended the call. I stood in the kitchen with my phone in my hand and the photograph of Alma on the table in front of me and the second date still blank on the back, and I thought about the land having a way of finding the people who suited it, and about the smell coming from the center of the field. and about what it meant that no one in any record I could find had ever noted Alma Greer leaving. That afternoon I drove the perimeter of the field. The farm road ran along the eastern boundary and then turned south along the bottom edge, the soybeans pressing up to the road's gravel shoulder with the specific assertiveness of a crop that has been very well fed. I stopped the car at the southern corner and looked west across the rows toward the field's center. From here in the daylight I could see what I had not been able to see from the house. A structure of some kind, half hidden by the crop, visible only as a vertical interruption in the flat horizontal logic of the field. A post or a frame, rising above the soybean height. It was too far and the crop was too thick for me to make out what it was. I sat in the car at the field's corner and looked at the vertical interruption and felt the specific cold of a question I was not yet prepared to ask directly. And then I drove back to the house and went inside and made dinner and did not go into the field. I went back to the county recorder's office the following Friday and asked for a different set of records. I wanted the death records for Hardin County, going back as far as they kept them. The clerk, a different one this time, a younger man who was more cautious with the historical materials than his colleague had been, said the pre-1920 records were on microfilm and the later ones were in the digitized database. He brought me the microfilm reader without asking why I wanted it, which I appreciated. I was looking for the women, the ones listed as tenants or boarders in the census data, the women with dark hair and pale complexions noted as being in apparent good health in each decade's enumeration. I was looking for their exits from the record, their deaths, or their departures, or whatever form the end of their time on the Vassar property had taken. What I found was that most of them did not have exits, not in the death records, not in any marriage record that would have explained a name change and a relocation. The women appeared in the census and the county papers' brief social notices, sometimes in the agricultural records as the farm's registered secondary occupant, and then they stopped appearing. The gap between their last record and the appearance of the next woman in the same role ranged from 1 year to 12, with no pattern I could identify. One exception, a woman named Clara Pettit, recorded in the 1910 census as a boarder at the Vassar farm, appeared in a death notice in the Hardin County Courier in 1922. The notice was 4 sentences. It stated that Clara Pettit, long a resident of Hardin County and a beloved presence in the Vassar household, had passed peacefully following a prolonged illness. It noted that she had been buried on the Vassar property in accordance with her wishes, in a location the family described as the heart of the farm. The heart of the farm. I photographed this on my phone and drove back to the farmhouse and stood in the kitchen and thought about what it meant to be buried at the heart of a farm, and what it meant that every other woman in the same position had simply stopped appearing in any record, and whether the two categories, the one who died and the ones who did not appear to die, represented two different outcomes or the same outcome documented differently by different decades and different levels of official scrutiny. I was a nurse. I had a nurse's relationship with death, which is not the relationship most people have. Not the polite distance of those who can choose not to look, but the close and specific knowledge of a person who has been in the room when it happens and understands its physical facts. I also had a nurse's relationship with prolonged illness, with the specific quality of a body that is in a slow process and producing, from that process, particular symptoms and particular smells. The smell from the center of the field had a name, I was understand. I had been smelling it for 3 weeks, and my body had known what it was before my mind was prepared to accept the identification. It was the smell of a person, not a dead person. I knew that smell, and it was different, more absolute, the smell of a process completed rather than ongoing. What came from the center of the Vassar field at night when the wind was right was the smell of a person in a prolonged illness, a person whose body was breaking down in the slow and specific way that bodies break down when they are alive and suffering and have been in that state for a long time. I stood in the kitchen and breathed through this identification, and let it settle into the category of things I now knew and could not unknow. And then I went to my next task. which was to find out who was currently in that field. I called the hospital records department from my personal phone during my lunch break on Tuesday and asked a colleague in admissions, a woman named Deborah, who I had become friendly with in the way of coworkers who share a lunchroom and a particular sense of what the job requires, whether the name Vassar appeared in any patient records from the past 5 years. I framed it as a follow-up inquiry for a patient who had mentioned the family name. Deborah said she could not share records directly, but could confirm whether a name appeared in the system. She called back an hour later and said no Vassar had been treated at Clarksdale County Hospital in the past 5 years. I thanked her and thought about what that meant. A woman in a prolonged illness on a farm 30 minutes from the county hospital who had not been brought to the county hospital, who was being managed, if she was being managed at all, outside the medical system, who was in the center of a field in conditions that the smell told me were not compatible with anything I would call care. On my next day off, I drove to the one other occupied farmhouse I had identified on the county road near the Vassar property. A white clapboard house set back from the road, with a rusted mailbox and a pickup truck in the drive. I knocked. A man in his 60s answered, wearing the clothes of a person who has been working outside all morning and is not yet changed. He looked at me with the expression of a Hardin County man looking at a woman he does not recognize at his door, which is an expression that contains caution and courtesy in proportions determined by context. I said I was the new tenant at the Vassar place and I was introducing myself to the neighbors. He said his name was Harmon Greer, and he had been on that road for 40 years. I registered the name, Greer, the same name as Alma from the 1943 photograph, and did not react to it. I said the farm was lovely. I said the soybean crop looked exceptional. He said it was always exceptional. He said it without pride, or with the specific kind of pride that has gone so far past itself, it has become something else. Resignation, or the flat acknowledgement of a fact that stopped requiring comment a long time ago. I asked if he had known the previous tenant. He said he had known several previous tenants. I asked what had happened to them. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not entirely read, something that sat between warning and the decision not to warn, the face of a person who knows something and has been living alongside the knowing long enough that it has become part of his face. He said the Vassar farm tended to have a high turnover in its tenants. He said the location was remote and not everyone adjusted to the Delta. He said most of the women who had rented from the Vassars had eventually moved on. I said most. He said most. I asked if Alma Greer was any relation to him. His hand tightened on the doorframe, not dramatically. A small increase in pressure, a whitening at the knuckles, the kind of physical response a person produces when they are holding themselves still against an involuntary reaction. He said Alma had been his grandmother's sister. He said she had come to Hardin County in '43 from over in Pontotoc County and had stayed. I said how long had she stayed? He looked at me for a long moment. The Delta afternoon was doing its particular work around us. The light coming off the flat land in the specific way that made everything look both very near and very far. Then he said, "She's still here as far as I know." He said it without the inflection of a man making a pleasant comment about a long-lived relative. He said it with the flat affect of a man reporting a fact that had stopped requiring inflection somewhere around the time he accepted it, which I estimated had been a very long time ago. I said she would be in her late 90s at least. He said the Vassar land had a way of keeping people. He said this, and then he said he needed to get back to his work, and I said of course, and he closed the door. And I stood on the porch of Harmon Greer's farmhouse for a moment looking at the Vassar property half a mile down the road, at the soybean field visible from here as a mass of green and abundance, at the slight interruption in the field's flat horizon that I now understood was not a post or a frame, but something else, something that had a person in it or on it or bound to it in some condition that the land was calling, keeping, and that I was calling by a different name. I drove back to the farmhouse. I parked and sat in the car for a moment in the Basser driveway with the engine off and the field to my left and the house in front of me and everything I had learned in 3 weeks arranged inside me, in the specific configuration of a person who has gathered enough information to understand the shape of something and who is deciding what to do with the shape. The smell was present even in the car, even in the afternoon, lighter than it was at night, but there, identifiable now, unmistakable to a nose that had made the identification and could not unmake it. I went inside. I took the photograph of Alma from the kitchen drawer and sat at the kitchen table with it. My face in an old photograph above a blank second date. The date Alma Greer had arrived, 1943, 81 years ago. The land has a way of keeping people. I sat with the photograph until the afternoon light changed and the field went from gold to the particular shadow of a delta evening, and then I took my phone and called a number I had not called in 2 years, which was my mother in Tupelo. She asked how the new place was. I said it was quiet. She asked if I'd made any friends. I said I was getting to know the neighbors. She said that was good, that was how you settled in. She asked if I was eating. I said I was eating fine. She said she was glad to hear it, that I had sounded tired the last time we talked, that she worried about me in that big house on my own. I said I was fine. I said I loved her. I said I would call again soon. I hung up and looked at the photograph of Alma and thought about Alma's family in Pontotoc County, who had presumably also called and been told she was fine at some point in 1943. And then had presumably stopped being able to call, or had stopped receiving answers that required calling again. I did not go into the field that night, or the next. What I did was begin to understand that the condition of my tenancy, do not go into the field at night, was not a safety instruction or an eccentric landlord's quirk. It was a management protocol. It was the instruction given to every woman who had rented this property, designed to keep the tenant functional, to keep her daily life proceeding normally for long enough that the land could assess whether she was the right one, whether her face matched the face in the photograph sufficiently, whether she would suit what the field required. The condition was not there to protect me. It was there to protect the assessment period. After the assessment period, the condition will no longer need to apply. The land did not do anything for 3 days. This was the part I had not anticipated, which in retrospect I should have. Cecil Vassar had said the field called on a night of its choosing, which implied a waiting period, a gap between the conversation and the consequence. 3 days of the ordinary farmhouse life proceeding in its ordinary way. The morning drive to Clarksdale, the shift at the hospital, the drive home in the late afternoon, the porch in the fading light. The dinner I made and ate alone at the kitchen table. 3 days of the smell in the evenings, stronger now, as though the field understood something had changed and was adjusting. 3 days of sleeping badly in the way of a person who has a specific thing to listen for and whose sleep is organized around the listening. No response from the Coahoma County Sheriff's Department. No response from my college friend in Jackson. My mother had replied to the email with a question mark and a phone call I had taken standing in the hospital parking lot during a break, in which she said the email was confusing and I should call her when I had a chance to talk properly. I said I would. I had not yet. I had made a second decision in the 3 days since Cecil Vassar's visit, alongside the decision to document and distribute. I was going to go into the field, not at night. The condition still had the logic of a warning I was not willing to ignore entirely until I understood more. But, in the daylight, in the full October afternoon, with my phone and my nursing bag and the specific preparation of a person going somewhere they do not know and want to be able to respond to what they find, I went on the 3rd day, a Sunday. I walked from the farmhouse into the field at 2 in the afternoon, entering at the northeastern corner where the rows began, stepping between the soybean stalks with the careful attention of a person in an unfamiliar space. The soybeans were tall, taller than my shoulder, and the rows were dense enough that the world beyond the immediate few feet of any direction was reduced to green, and the particular hum of a crop at the end of its season. The dry rattle of pods, the dusty sweetness intensifying as I moved deeper, the sound of my own footsteps on the turned earth. The smell grew with every row I passed. It was different inside the field than it was on the porch or through the window. Outside it had been diffuse, ambient, the smell of something at a distance. Inside the field, moving toward its center, it became directional. Something I was moving toward, rather than something surrounding me. A gradient that told me I was getting closer the way a smell always tells you when you are approaching its source. I walked for perhaps 10 minutes through the rows before the field opened. The clearing was not large, 20 feet across, perhaps slightly more, a circle of bare earth at the field's center where nothing grew. The soil in the clearing was the darkest I had seen anywhere on the property. A black so dense it looked wet, and it had the specific quality of earth that has received something over a very long time, not fertilized, but fed, the distinction being the one that mattered. In the center of the clearing stood what I had seen from the farm road, a wooden cross structure, old, the wood darkened with decades of weather, the crossbeam set at a height that matched a standing person's outstretched arms, and on the cross, Alma Greer. I want to be precise about this because I am a nurse, and precision is what I have, and it is what I owe her. She was alive. She was breathing. I could see the rise and fall of her chest from 20 feet away, the shallow but present rhythm of a respiratory system that had been maintaining its function for 81 years, in circumstances no respiratory system was designed to maintain. She was bound to the cross with what appeared to be cloth bindings, pale with age, wrapped around her wrists and waist and ankles in the worn and loosened way of restraints that have been in place long enough to have become part of the structure rather than additions to it. She wore clothing I could not date, what had been clothing, at some point, now so degraded by weather and time that it was closer to wrapping than garment. Her dark hair was white, entirely white, fine as cobweb in the October light. Her face, this is the part that required most of the nurse's training, the most of the practiced management of the interior experience, because her face was still her face. 81 years had done what 81 years does to a body bound to a cross in a Mississippi field. The skin drawn tight, the features reduced by long exposure to heat and cold and the specific consumption of whatever the land was taking from her. But the proportions remained. The jaw, the brow, the distance between the eyes, the chin with its particular tilt, the chin that appeared in every photograph throughout the farmhouse, the chin that appeared in the small, unframed photograph in the kitchen drawer, the chin that I saw in my bathroom mirror every morning. She was looking at me. Her eyes were open. They had the specific quality of eyes that had been looking at the same thing for a very long time. Not unfocused, not vacant, but inhabited in a way that ordinary eyes are not, settled into a mode of attention that had long since moved past effort and become a kind of permanent state. The way a person who has been holding their breath for years develops a different relationship to breathing than a person who has never needed to think about it. I walked to the edge of the clearing and stopped. I did not go closer. I had my phone out and I was photographing, and I was noting in the clinical automatic way that emergency nursing produces. What I was observing, the skin color, which was abnormal but not in any category I recognized from my training. The breathing, which was shallow but regular. The visible joints and extremities, which showed the evidence of long-term exposure and the specific changes of a body in prolonged arrested deterioration. The expression on her face, which was the hardest thing to note, and which I noted anyway. She was afraid, not panicked. Fear that has been present for 8 decades arrives differently than fear that is new. It was the specific quality of a person who has been frightened for so long that the fear has become structural, has become part of how they hold themselves and look at the world and breathe the air. She was looking at me with that fear and, underneath the fear, something else that I needed a moment to identify. Recognition. She recognized me. Not me specifically. She could not have known who I was, had never seen me before. She recognized my face. She was looking at my face, the way she might have looked at her own face in a mirror, if she had seen a mirror in the past 81 years. And the recognition was producing something in her expression that was either gratitude or horror, with a specific emotional location that exists when those two things are the same. I said her name. Alma. She tried to speak. What came out was not words. Her voice, whatever it had been, was gone in the way of a voice that has been disused for decades, and whose apparatus has forgotten the mechanics of speech, the way a body forgets any skill it stops being able to practice. But something happened in her face that told me she had heard me, that my saying her name had arrived and been received by whoever was still present inside what the Wasser field had been keeping. I said I was a nurse. I said I was going to get help. I said I had already contacted the authorities and that help was coming. I said she had been seen and I knew she was here and I was not going to leave without telling people she was here. I do not know how much of this she understood. I do not know what her cognitive function was after 81 years of the keeping. What remained of the mind that had arrived in Hardin County in 1943, with a face that matched and a constitution the land found suitable. What I know is what her face did when I said the words I had said, which was that it changed. Slowly, imperfectly, with the difficulty of a face that has not had occasion to make this particular configuration in a very long time. She was trying to smile. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at Alma Greer trying to smile and felt the specific thing that a nurse feels when she is in a room and there is someone in that room who is suffering, and who has been suffering without witness. Where suffering has been taking place in a location outside any system that would have noticed or responded to it. It is not sentiment. It is closer to fury, to the specific cold anger of a professional who understands what should have been done and was not done, who understands how long the not doing has been going on and what it has cost. I took photographs. I recorded the video. I said her name again and told her to hold on, that I was coming back, that I was getting help. Then I heard the truck on the farm road. I turned. Through the soybean rows I could see at the field's edge the black pickup truck that had brought Cecil Vassar to my front door 3 days earlier. It was moving slowly along the farm road with the patient pace of a vehicle that is not in a hurry because its driver does not believe there is anywhere for the person they are watching to go. I looked at Alma. She had heard the truck too. Her expression had returned to the structural fear, the settled, long-practiced version, and she was looking at me with something that wanted to be a warning, but that her face could not quite assemble into the shape of a warning anymore. I thought about Elias and the story I had been carrying in the back of my mind since Harmon Greer had said, "The land never lets go." The boy who had run through the cornfield and found there was no exit, whose feet had carried him in circles back to the clearing. I thought about the Vassarland's reported quality of keeping people, of calling them back, of making departure feel impossible. And then I thought about what I had done before I came into the field, the emails, the documentation, the sheriff's department subject line, the specific nursing discipline of creating a record that exists independently of you before you go somewhere you might not come back from. I turned away from the truck and walked deeper into the soybeans on the far side of the clearing, moving west away from the farm road, toward the field's western boundary and the county road beyond it, and I did not look back. The soybeans pressed against me on both sides, the pods rattling at shoulder height, the smell of the field surrounding me as I moved through it, the sweetness, the decay underneath, the breath of the land that had been breathing this way for 180 years, and that I was inside of now, moving through its body, trying to find the edge of it. I could hear the truck behind me on the farm road. I could hear my own breathing. I could not hear Alma Greer, because Alma Greer had not made a sound that I could hear, but I was carrying the image of her face trying to smile, and I was going to carry it out of the field and into the daylight and into every room I sat in, for the rest of my life. And that was the correct thing to carry. I reached the western boundary of the field in 14 minutes. The boundary was a drainage ditch, 3 feet wide and running with the slow brown water that the Delta's agricultural ditches carry in October, and beyond it, the county road. I crossed the ditch in 2 steps and stood on the road's gravel shoulder and looked back at the field behind me, the soybeans closing the rows I had come through, the field presenting its green and ordinary face to the road in the sky and the cotton dust blowing south, giving no indication of what was at its center. Cecil Vassar's truck was not visible from here. I had not heard it enter the field after me, which meant either that it had not, or that I had been moving too quickly through the soybean noise to hear it. I stood on the county road and breathed the open air, which smelled of diesel and dry grass and the ordinary October of a Mississippi county road, and I felt my hands shaking, which I noted the way a nurse notes a physiological response, not with alarm, but with the awareness that my body was doing something it did not usually do, and that the reason it was doing it was the clearing, and Alma, and the face she was making when she heard my voice. I walked south along the county road toward Harmon Greer's farmhouse. He answered the door without surprise, which meant either that he had heard the truck or that he had been expecting this, or both. He stepped back from the door and let me in without speaking, which was its own kind of answer to a question I had not yet asked. His kitchen was the kitchen of a man who had been in the same house for 40 years. Everything in its place, nothing decorative. The accumulated efficiency of a person who has stopped needing to think about where anything is. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove, and set one in front of me and sat down across the table and looked at me with the expression he had been wearing since I first knocked on his door. The one I'd categorized as caught between warning and the decision not to warn. I said I had been inside the field. He said he had figured. I said I had seen Alma. His hands closed around his coffee cup. He said yes. I said she had been there since 1943. He said yes. I said what I had seen was not a person dying. What I had seen was a person who had been in a specific state of sustained living for 81 years. A state that my training did not have a category for, but that my eyes knew was not the natural process of aging, and that was not compatible with any medical framework I had been educated in. He said the land did not age them the way time aged people. He said it held them. He said the keeping was not what most people meant when they said suffering. That it was more like suspension, like being held at a specific point and not being allowed to move past it in either direction. I said it looked like suffering to me. He looked at his coffee. He said he supposed it would. I said I needed to know who the Vassars were talking to in the county, who they had on their side. The sheriff's department had not responded to my email. I needed to know whether the not responding was bureaucratic slowness or something else. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the Vassar family had been central to Hardin County for 180 years, which meant the county institutions had been arranged around them, in the same way a river bottom was arranged around a large stone. The stone did not control the river, but everything in the river had learned to move around it. The sheriff's office knew the Vassar farm the way it knew any prominent family's property, as a place where certain things happened that were not discussed, where certain calls did not get returned, where certain complaints had a way of being filed and then going quiet. I asked whether that meant my email had been forwarded to Cecil Vassar. He said he probably did not move forward. He probably noted and set aside. He said there was a difference between complicity and willful blindness, and that most of Hardin County had chosen the second because the first required active participation, and the second only required continuing to look at the road in front of you. I asked about the state police. He said the state police were a different matter. He said the Vassars had county reach, but not state reach, and that if my documentation had been complete enough, and the journalist in Jackson had opened it and read it and found it credible, the state police were the right channel. I asked what would happen when the state police came to the Vassar farm. He looked at me steadily. He said he did not know what would happen to Alma when the land's keeping was interrupted. He said in 3 generations of knowing about the arrangement, no one had ever interrupted it before the land was ready to release its keeper. He said he did not know what the land did when something it was holding was taken from it before the cycle completed. He said he did not know if Alma could survive being removed. This was the information I had been afraid of and had known was coming. I sat with it at Harmon Greer's kitchen table and thought about what surviving meant in Alma's context. For a woman who had been in the keeping for 81 years and whose body had accommodated itself to conditions that had no medical parallel, survival of removal might mean something different for her than it meant for anyone I had treated in a Memphis ICU or a Clarksdale County hospital. The framework might not apply. I did not know. A nurse's most honest sentence, the one I had said more times than I could count. I do not know, but I am going to find out. I asked Harmon Greer why he had told me the things he told me. He was quiet again. Then he said Alma had been his grandmother's sister, which I knew. He said his grandmother had died knowing what had happened to Alma and had died unable to change it. He said his mother had died the same way. He said he had been living 40 years a mile down the road from the Vassar field with the knowledge of what was in it, and that he had been 40 years in the process of deciding whether doing nothing was an acceptable choice or the choice of a person who had decided their own comfort was more important than someone else's suffering. He said he had not finished deciding. But, he said when I knocked on his door, it had seemed like information arriving that deserved to be passed forward rather than held. I thanked him. I asked if he would make a formal statement to the state police if they came. He said yes. I asked if he would come with me back to the farmhouse to retrieve my belongings while Cecil Vassar's truck was still on the farm road. He said yes to that too, and stood and got his keys, redrove his truck along the county road to the Vassar driveway, and went inside the farmhouse together. And I collected the duffel bag from the bedroom and the photograph of Alma from the duffel bag's interior pocket, and stood in the kitchen one final time and looked at the photographs on the hallway wall, the same face across a century. The dark wood frames hung at the precise same height, the curation of a family that had been maintaining its arrangement with great care for a very long time. And I took one photograph down from the wall and put it in the duffel bag. Not for sentiment, for evidence, for the documentation that needed to exist independently of me. I looked through the kitchen window at the field for the last time. The soybeans were moving slightly in the October wind, the heavy pods rattling with the dry sound of a crop at harvest, and somewhere beyond the rows the clearing was doing whatever the clearing did in the afternoon, holding Alma, feeding the soil, keeping the crows from the grain with whatever force of living was still in her after 81 years of being held. The smell reached me through the window glass. It reached me the way it always had, from the center outward, and I stood in the kitchen and let it reach me and named it correctly for what it was, which I had been able to do since the 3rd week and which I had finally allowed myself to name without deflection. The smell of a person. A specific person, alive in a specific place, whose life was being used by the land that held her. Harmon Greer said my name from the doorway. I went with him. We drove to Clarksdale, and I called my journalist friend in Jackson from the hospital parking lot, and she had read the email, and she had questions, and I answered them for an hour, standing by my car in the October afternoon with Harmon Greer sitting in the truck, waiting with the patience of a man who had been waiting for a long time and had decided this was the waiting that counted. My journalist friend said she was calling the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation in the morning and that she needed me to send the photographs and the video from the field. I said I would. She said stay somewhere other than the farmhouse tonight. I said I had already thought of that. She said she was sorry this had happened to me. I said I was fine, and I meant it in the way that nurses mean it, which is that I am functional and I am doing what needs to be done, and the other things are being held for later, when there is time for them. The Mississippi Bureau of Investigation arrived on Tuesday. 2 agents, a man and a woman, in a state vehicle that was not marked. but that had the specific quality of a vehicle used for official business, certain in a way that civilian cars are not, parked with a precision that suggested the driver had been trained to park that way. They met me in the Clarksdale Holiday Inn parking lot, where I had spent 2 nights in a room that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and had a window that faced the highway. And I sat with them in their car for 90 minutes and told them everything in the order it had happened. They listened in the way of investigators who have been trained to listen, giving nothing back that could be interpreted as confirmation or disbelief, asking questions that clarified sequence rather than challenging substance. The woman, whose name was Agent Trevane, asked me twice about the photographs and the video from the field. I sent them from my phone to her email while we were sitting in the car, and she looked at them on her phone with the careful attention of a person deciding what category to put something in. And she put it in a category she did not name to me, but that I could read from her face, which was the category of things that required immediate action. They went to the Vassar farm that afternoon. I know this because Harmon Greer, who had agreed to be present when they arrived, and who had the jurisdiction of a man who had been a neighbor of that property for 40 years, called me at 3:15 to say that the agents had entered the property, and that Cecil Vassar had met them at the farmhouse door, and that there had been a conversation he could not hear. He called again at 4:47 to say that the agents had entered the field. He called again at 5:30. His voice when he spoke had the quality of a voice that is reporting something it has not yet assembled into the form of understanding, something it is passing forward in pieces because the whole is too large to deliver at once. He said they had found her. He said she was alive. He said the MBI had called for medical support, and that the Clarksdale County Hospital had sent a team, and that the team was in the field. I drove to the Vassar property. I did not go in. The property was now an active scene, vehicles in the driveway and figures moving in the field visible through the soybean rows from the farm road, but I parked on the county road and stood outside my car and looked at the field in the October late afternoon light, and thought about what was happening in the clearing at its center. I thought about the moment of removal, about what it meant for a body that had been in the keeping for 81 years to be released from it. The bindings cut, the weight redistributed, the cross that had been holding her form upright for decades suddenly not holding it. I thought about the medical team going in, about what they were encountering in terms that their training had given them and what they were encountering in terms that their training had not. I thought about whether their instruments would know how to read her, whether the numbers on their monitors would mean what numbers on monitors usually meant, whether the protocols designed for ordinary human bodies and ordinary medical emergencies would apply to a body that had been in an extraordinary situation for 8 decades. I was a nurse. I should have been in there. I knew I should have been in there, but I had not been asked, and the scene was active. And I stood on the county road and understood that the limit of what I could do had been reached in the field 2 days earlier, when I had photographed and recorded and said her name and told her help was coming, and that the rest of it now belonged to other people doing other work, and that this was how it should go, and that accepting the limit of what I had been able to do was its own form of completion. Harmon Greer came to stand beside me on the road. He had walked from his own property, a half-mile south, and he was breathing slightly hard from the walk and wearing the same clothes he had been wearing every time I had seen him. He stood beside me and looked at the field and did not say anything, and I did not say anything. And we stood together on the county road in the October light, while the activity in the field continued in a form we could not see, but could hear in fragments, voices, the sound of equipment, once a radio crackling with communication between the field and the road. At 6:14, the medical team came out of the field. They were carrying a stretcher, and on the stretcher was a form, and the form was covered with a thermal blanket and attached to monitoring equipment, and it was small under the blanket, and the way that a person is small when they have been reduced by time and the elements and whatever else the keeping involves, and it was alive, which I could tell from the way the team was moving, not the pace of people transporting a body, but the controlled urgency of people transporting a patient, the specific coordination of a medical team with something to manage. I stepped forward from the road shoulder. Agent Trevane, who had come out behind the stretcher, saw me and came over. She said they had found her as described. She said the medical team's preliminary assessment was that she was alive, but that her condition was unlike anything the team had a protocol for, and that she was being transferred to the University of Mississippi Medical Center in Jackson for evaluation. She said she could not tell me more than that at this time. I asked if I could see her. Agent Trevane looked at me for a moment. Then she walked with me to where the stretcher was being loaded into the ambulance, and the team made space, and I looked inside. Alma Greer's face was turned toward the ambulance door. Her eyes were open. They had the same inhabited quality they had had in the field, the settled, long-practiced attention of a person who has been looking at the same thing for decades and who now, suddenly, has something different to look at. She was looking at the farmhouse visible from this angle through the soybean rows, the white clapboard of it, the covered porch facing west. I said her name. Her eyes moved to my face. The recognition again. The same recognition as in the clearing. The knowledge of my face as the face she had been wearing before the keeping. The face the land had chosen her for in the first place because it matched the face in the photographs, and the face the photographs were trying to preserve across 180 years of Vesper. Abundance. But something else now alongside the recognition. Something that the clearing had not had the space for, or that she had not had the capacity for in the clearing, or that had required the removal in the open air and the October light outside the field's boundary to be expressible. She was looking at me the way a person looks at someone they want to thank and cannot, whose throat has forgotten speech, and whose hands are under a blanket, but whose face still has this one capacity left, this one thing it can still do after 81 years. It can look at another person and be seen looking, and the looking can mean what it means, and the other person can receive it and carry it forward into the world the way it deserves to be carried. I said she was going to be all right. I said help had come. I said she had held on long enough, and she did not have to hold on anymore. I said this, and I did not know whether any of it was true in the sense of being medically predictable. I did not know what her prognosis was, or whether the UMMC team would have any framework for it, or whether 81 years of the keeping had left anything in her that conventional medicine could stabilize and sustain. I said it because it was the thing that needed to be said to a person in a moment like this one, because a nurse says what needs to be said in the moment the patient is in. And what Alma Greer's moment required was someone looking at her and saying, "It is over, and you are seen, and you do not have to hold on alone anymore." The ambulance doors closed. I stood on the Vassar driveway and watched it move down the farm road and turn onto the county road and head north toward Clarksdale and the highway to Jackson, and then I stood there for a while after it was gone. The field was quiet. The investigation team was still inside it, working, documenting what they found in the clearing. The cross, the bindings, the soil. The soybean crop stood in its rows, heavy and abundant, and the October light was the delta light of late afternoon, horizontal and gold, the same light I had been watching from the covered porch since September. The same light I'd been calling beautiful before I understood what was producing the conditions that made it look that way. Cecil Vassar had been taken from the property in the state vehicle. I had watched this from the road without satisfaction and without grief. The way you watch a fact conclude. The fact being that 180 years of the Vassar arrangement had been interrupted, that the chain had been broken, that whatever came next for the field and the family and the county would not include a woman bound to a cross in the center of a soybean crop kept alive to feed the soil and frighten the crows. What came next for Alma Greer was a question I did not have the answer to. What came next for me was a motel room and a call to my mother and a shift at the hospital in the morning, because the ordinary life was still there and still required me. And the ordinary life was what I had been trying to find when I came to the Delta, which now struck me as exactly the wrong reason to come anywhere, but also exactly the right one. because if I had not been looking for quiet and ordinary, I would not have been the person who stood on the farm road's southern corner and noticed the vertical interruption in the flat horizontal logic of the field and followed the noticing to its conclusion. Harmon Greer drove me back to the Holiday Inn. We did not talk much on the way. When we arrived, he said he was glad I had come to knock on his door. I said I was glad he had answered it. The field was still standing when I drove past it for the last time on my way north to Memphis 6 days later. The soybeans had been harvested in my absence, by whom I did not know, the normal operations of the farm presumably continuing under whatever authority had assumed temporary management during the investigation, and the field was cut and flat under the November sky, the stalks gone, the dark soil exposed. The clearing at its center visible now from the road as a circle of soil slightly darker than the rest, a place where the earth had been fed for a very long time and that the eye went to without being asked, and that I passed without stopping and carried north in the way you carry a thing that is not finished with you yet. Not as a wound, but as a fact, the fact of Alma Greer's face in the ambulance light and the one thing it could still do. Alma Greer survived the removal. I learned this on a Wednesday in November, 3 weeks after I had driven north out of Hardin County with the field cut flat behind me and the cleared circle at its center visible from the road for the first time. Agent Trevane called while I was in the hospital break room eating a sandwich, and she told me the UMMC team had stabilized Alma's condition, and that she was conscious and responsive in a limited capacity, and that the medical team was describing her situation as unlike anything in the literature, which I had expected, and that they were proceeding carefully and conservatively, and that her prognosis was, in the team's cautious language, uncertain, but not immediately unfavorable. Agent Trevane said the investigation was proceeding. She said the Vassar property had been seized pending the outcome of the proceedings against Cecil Vassar, who had been charged under multiple statutes that the agent listed in the clip's language of law enforcement reporting. She said the documentation I had provided, the photographs, the video, the emails, the notes, had been foundational to the case, and that the Bureau was grateful for the thoroughness. I thanked her and asked about Alma's family. She said they had located a nephew in Pontotoc County, a man in his 70s who was Alma's only living blood relative, and that he had been notified. She said he had taken the news in the way that a man takes news that is both terrible and the resolution of something he had suspected for a very long time without being able to confirm it. With grief and without surprise, which was its own kind of grief, I asked if I could visit her. Agent Trevane said she would check with the medical team and call me back. She called back the following morning and said yes, that Alma had been informed that a woman named June Calloway was asking to visit, and that the medical team had assessed and approved a brief visit, and that Alma's response to the information, communicated through the limited means available to her, which at this stage was eye movement and occasional facial expression, had been what the attending nurse described as clear and positive. I drove to Jackson on a Saturday. The UMMC was large in the way of major teaching hospitals, the kind of institution that has the specific quality of a place where medicine happens at its most serious and most uncertain simultaneously. I found the ward and found the attending nurse, and was taken to the room where Alma Greer was, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before I went in. She looked different than she had in the field. The medical team had done what medical teams do, the monitoring equipment, the IV line, the careful positioning of a body that has spent 81 years in one posture and requires considerable support to hold any other. The thermal blanket was gone. She wore a hospital gown and was covered with a white sheet, and her white hair had been brushed and lay spread on the pillow in a way that was the first thing about her I had seen that looked comfortable. That looked like something done for her rather than to her or despite her. Her face turned toward me when I came in. The recognition arrived the same way it had arrived twice before, as a fact that preceded thought. The face, knowing the face before the person behind it had finished deciding what to know. I sat in the chair beside the bed and said her name. She looked at me. Her eyes had changed from what they had been in the field. Not in their color, which was still the light gray of eyes that have looked at a great deal and absorbed it, but in their quality. In the field, they had been the eyes of a person in a permanent state of vigilance, the eyes of something that had been keeping watch for so long that the watching had replaced whatever the eyes had been doing before. Now they had the quality of eyes that have been allowed to rest, that are still learning what resting feels like, that are not entirely certain yet that resting is a condition that can be trusted. I said I was glad she was here. I said I was glad she had made it out of the field. Her face moved, the same slow, difficult configuration as in the clearing, the same face working to make a shape it had not had occasion to make in a very long time. Less effort now, I thought, incrementally. Less. I talked to her for an hour. I told her about Harmon Greer and about his grandmother, who had been Alma's sister. I told her that the MBI had found what was in the field and that the Vassars were facing prosecution and that the farm had been seized. I told her that her nephew in Pontotoc County had been notified and wanted to come when she was ready. I told her that my journalist friend had published the account and that it had been read widely and that what had been hidden in the Vassar field for 180 years was no longer hidden. I told her she had been seen, that what had happened to her was known, that the record existed and would continue to exist regardless of what came next. She could not speak. Her voice, the attending nurse had told me, was likely gone permanently, the vocal apparatus having been disused for decades past the point of recovery. But she had other meanings. Her face was learning them slowly and imperfectly, the way a face learns anything after a very long period of not being used for its full range of expression. And when I told her about the record, about the documentation, about the account I had written and sent before I went into the field, when I told her that what had happened to her was written down and would not be unmade, something in her face arrived at the configuration that I had been watching her work toward since the clearing. She smiled. Not the trying this time, the thing itself, imperfect and slow and entirely real. The smile of a woman in a hospital bed in Jackson, Mississippi, who had been held in a field in Hardin County for 81 years, and who was being told that it was over, and that the world knew. I stayed for the full hour the medical team had allocated, and then I said goodbye and said I would come back, and I stood in the doorway on the way out and looked at her one more time. She was still looking at me. Her face had settled back into its resting expression, which was still learning what resting meant, but was learning it. The monitoring equipment beeped its steady, patient rhythm. The white sheet was folded neatly at her chest. Through the window behind her bed, the November Jackson afternoon was doing its ordinary work. Clouds moving south, the city visible in its ordinary complexity below the hospital's height. I thought about what Harmon Greer had said in his kitchen, that he did not know if Alma could survive being removed, that no one had ever interrupted the keeping before the land was ready to release its keeper, that the land's response to having something taken from it was unknown. She had survived. The land had not called her back, or had lost whatever claim it held when the cross was dismantled and the bindings cut, or had simply, and this was the possibility I found most bearable, had simply lost its argument, the argument that a body and a life could be held in service of a family's abundance without anyone outside the field's boundary understanding what was happening. The argument had ended. Before I left the hospital, I stopped at the gift shop on the ground floor and bought a small plant, a succulent in a terracotta pot, the kind that requires very little maintenance and that lasts a long time with minimal attention. And I took it back upstairs and left it on the windowsill of Alma's room. The attending nurse, who was at the nursing station outside the room, said she would make sure it stayed watered. I said I would be back in 2 weeks. She said they would let Alma know. I drove back to Memphis on the interstate, the November Mississippi afternoon giving way to a Tennessee evening, the landscape flattening and then rising as the land lifted toward the ridge country north of the state line. I had the radio on and the heater on, and the window cracked slightly. because I had developed, in my 2 months in the Delta, a habit of needing some air, some current, some reminder that the outside was continuous with the inside, and that the boundaries between them were permeable in ordinary, non-sinister ways. The photograph of Alma, the small unframed one from the kitchen drawer, the one with my face looking back at me from decades before my birth, was in the duffel bag on the back seat, along with the photograph I had taken from the farmhouse wall. I had given copies of both to the NBI and to the journalist, but I had kept the originals, not as trophies, not as reminders of what I had survived, which was less than Alma had survived and did not require the same quality of memorial. I had kept them because they were the documentation, the evidence that the land had been choosing faces for a very long time, that the selection process was documented in dark wood frames hung at a consistent height throughout a farmhouse in Hardin County, that what had been done to Alma Greer had been done with full intention and preparation, and the expectation of continuing indefinitely. The documentation needed to exist. It needed to be in the world in more than one location. It needed to be in the possession of someone who would carry it forward into rooms and conversations where it could do the work that documentation is supposed to do, which is to make something undeniable, to put the fact of a thing in front of people who have the authority to respond to facts. I was a nurse. I had been a nurse for 7 years, and the central skill of nursing, the skill that every other skill rests on, was this: bear witness to what is actually happening, not to what should be happening, not to what would be easier to see, not to what the family wants you to see, or what the patient is too frightened to report accurately, to what is actually there, to the body's truth, which does not negotiate and does not manage impressions, and does not care about anyone's comfort, including the nurses. I had borne witness. Alma's face in the ambulance light was what I was carrying north, and it was the correct thing to carry. I called Harmon Greer from a rest stop outside Hernando, and told him she had survived and was in Jackson and had smiled. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that was good news, and his voice had the quality of a man for whom those 3 words were carrying considerably more weight than 3 words usually carry, and I let them carry it, and then I said I would be in touch, and he said he appreciated that, and we ended the call, and I drove the rest of the way to Memphis with the November dark coming on and the city lights gathering ahead of me and the work of the next part of this beginning to take the shape it would need. It is February now. 4 months since I left Hardin County, and 3 months since I moved back to Memphis permanently, into a second-floor apartment on a street with other apartments on it, and a coffee shop on the corner, and the ordinary noise of a city that does not know what it is adjacent to and does not need to. I am writing this account from the kitchen table of that apartment, which is a different kitchen table from the one in the Basser farmhouse, but which is, in the ordinary logic of kitchen tables everywhere, still the place where the serious work of a life gets done when the serious work is not being done at the hospital. I have a window that faces east. The February morning light comes through it at an angle that has nothing of the Delta's horizontal gold in it. This is winter city light, flat and clear, the light of a northern version of a southern city that has decided to be practical about the season. I returned to the Clarksdale Hospital position for 6 weeks after the investigation. I had a lease and a position and a life in the county that had begun before the field, and that I was not willing to concede entirely to what the field had been. I worked my shifts. I drove the county roads. I passed the Vassar property twice a week on the route between Clarksdale and the farmhouse where I was still paying rent, and the property was always quiet and always gated now. MBI tape still on the mailbox in the first weeks, then removed. Then just the locked gate and the cut field behind it, and the circle at the center that the harvested soybean rows left visible. I looked at it every time I passed. I have been thinking about why, and I think it is the same reason that nurses check their patients' vitals even when they expect the numbers to be stable. Because looking is the practice. Because the practice is what produces the readiness. Because the readiness is what allows you to respond when the numbers change. I looked at the field to confirm that it was still cut, still flat, still not producing the abundance it had produced when Alma was in it. The first hard freeze of November had come through, and the exposed soil had gone pale and ordinary, and the circle at the center had become a slightly different shade of ordinary from the rest, which was all it was now. A place where something had been, distinguishable from the surrounding earth only by the difference in what the earth had been fed. I drove past it for the last time on the morning I left for Memphis, and I did not stop, and I did not feel the need to. The changes in the daily life have been the kind that do not announce themselves. I sleep differently, not worse, not better, but differently, with a quality of attention to the night that I did not have before. Not the anxious listening of the Holiday Inn, not the specific waiting I had done in the farmhouse. Something quieter and more permanent than those. The way a person who has been in a specific kind of situation develops. Afterward, a specific kind of attentiveness that is not fear, but is adjacent to fear, and that serves a protective function without being organized around protection. I smell different things. This is the most concrete change, and the one I find easiest to describe precisely. My olfactory system has been recalibrated by 3 months of learning to distinguish the ordinary smell of agricultural land from the smell of something happening in agricultural land, and the recalibration has not undone itself now that I am back in a city. I notice smells now with a specificity I did not have before the Delta. The difference between the coffee shop's morning smell and its afternoon smell, the particular quality of the hospital's east corridor versus its west, the way the stairwell in my apartment building smells different on Tuesdays when someone on the 3rd floor cooks something with curry. I had always noticed smells, but I had not always attended to them, and now I attend to them the way a person attends to things they have learned can contain information. I visited Alma 3 times. Jackson is 3.5 hours from Memphis, which is a drive I have learned to make with the radio off for the first hour while I think about what I am going to say, and with the radio on for the second 2 hours while I stop thinking about it, and let the road be the road. The visits have been what medical team visits are when the patient is making slow progress in an unusual situation. Careful, brief, managed around what she can receive and what is too much and what the attending team has assessed as useful versus demanding. She is learning to communicate with more precision. Eye movement first, then limited facial expression, now some hand movement. The left hand, which was on the side that the bindings left with more residual function. The UMMC team does not know yet what recovery looks like for a body in her situation, and they are being honest about not knowing, which is the quality in a medical team I trust most. They are learning alongside her. Her nephew from Pontotoc came in December. I was not there for that visit, but the attending nurse told me about it the 3rd time I went, said the nephew had sat with her for 2 hours, and that it had been, in the nurse's words, one of the harder and most important things she had witnessed in 20 years of hospital work. I thought about that for a long time. The account I am writing now is for the journalist in Jackson, who has been reporting the story in pieces as the legal proceedings advance, and for the record, and for whoever needs it to exist in this form, the first-person account of a nurse who rented a house in Hardin County and noticed a coat lining was wrong, and followed the noticing until it had gone, as far as it could go, which turned out to be further than she had expected, and to a place she had not known was there. The title arrived in January, on a morning when I was driving to the hospital in the specific early Memphis light that comes off the Mississippi River. When the sky is clear and the temperature is below freezing, the light that turns the river's surface into something almost metallic, silver and still and moving simultaneously. I was thinking about the smell of the field. It comes back to me in the way that significant sensory experiences come back, uninvited and specific, and about what to call what I was writing. And the title arrived without announcement. They kept, not for the land's name for it, for what it means when you say it, without the Vassar context, without the Covenant's vocabulary, what it means in the ordinary sense, something held, something maintained, something that has been given care over time. Alma Greer kept. in the land sense and in the other sense simultaneously, both of them true at once, neither one canceling the other. She had been held by the field, and she had been kept in the sense of being preserved, being sustained, being the thing that persisted when persistence was what the situation required. She had been kept alive for 81 years in conditions that should not have sustained life, and she had stayed present in those conditions, and her face had been trying to smile when I said her name in the clearing, and that was the thing that the title needed to hold. I called Harmon Greer in January to tell him the account was almost finished. He said he was glad. He said he had been talking to the MBI about giving a formal statement and that the process was moving forward. He said the Vassar property had been formally transferred to state custody, and that there was some discussion of what would be done with it, whether the land could be cleared of what it had accumulated over 180 years of the covenant, or whether some element of what was in the soil was simply there now and would remain there, regardless of what happened on the surface. I said I did not know. I said I thought some things could be cleared and some things could not, and that the important thing was knowing the difference. He said that was true of most situations. I said it was. The succulent on Alma's hospital windowsill is still alive. The attending nurse texts me a photograph of it every few weeks, which she began doing in December after I asked once how it was holding up, understanding that what I was actually asking was how Alma was holding up, and that the plant was a more manageable vehicle for the answer. It is still in its terracotta pot. It is the kind of plant that requires very little and lasts a very long time, which is a quality I chose deliberately because Alma Greer had demonstrated that endurance was a thing a person could do, even when the conditions made it seem impossible, and because the plant on the windowsill was the small material fact of that demonstration, sitting in the February light of a hospital room in Jackson, alive and undemanding and entirely itself. I finished the account on a Sunday evening in February, the city quiet outside the window, and the February dark coming on early the way it does in cities that have decided to be practical about winter. I sent it to the journalist, and to the MBI, and to my own email, and to my mother, who had been asking about it since October, and who deserved to read it in full rather than in the pieces I had been giving her. Then I put the two photographs, Alma's and the one from the farmhouse wall, in a manila envelope in the filing cabinet in the second bedroom where I keep the things that need to exist and to be findable. I turned off the kitchen light and stood at the window for a moment in the dark, and the Memphis night was doing what the Memphis night does, which is to proceed with total indifference to what has happened in any room in it. And I stood in the indifference for a moment and found it, for the first time in a long time, comfortable. I drove back to Hardin County in March, not to the Vassar property. The property was still in state custody, and the gate was still locked, and I had no reason and no permission to go to the field, and I did not want to go to the field. What I went back for was Alma, or rather for the act of being in the county where Alma had been kept, which is a different thing from visiting her and which felt like a different kind of necessary. She had been moved from UMMC Jackson to a rehabilitation facility in Clarksdale in February, which the medical team had considered a significant development. The move itself, the decision that she was stable enough to be closer to the community she had come from and the county she had been held in, the determination that proximity to the Delta landscape was something the recovery should involve rather than avoid. I did not fully understand the medical reasoning and did not need to. What I understood was that she was there, 30 minutes south of Memphis, on the same state road that had brought me to Hardin County the previous September, and that the drive I was making in March was the same drive I had made in September, but in the opposite condition, going toward rather than arriving at, the outcome known rather than unknown, the field behind me rather than ahead. The rehabilitation facility was a modest building on the north side of Clarksdale, set back from the road behind a parking lot with Bradford pear trees along its border, the kind of institution that has the specific quality of a place designed to support recovery in people for whom recovery is possible and ongoing. The attending staff knew who I was and brought me to the common room where Alma was sitting in a wheelchair by the south-facing windows, the March Delta light coming through the glass at the particular angle of a season that is not yet committed to warmth but has stopped pretending to be winter. She looked different from the hospital. The hospital had the quality of a place organized around intervention, around managing a crisis in active progress. The rehabilitation facility had the quality of a place organized around what comes next, the slower work, the work of learning what a body can do when it has been returned to itself from a condition it should not have survived. She was thinner than an ordinary woman her age would be, the structure of her face more visible than softened, but she was upright in the wheelchair with the specific effort of someone who has been learning uprightness as a skill again and has gotten enough of a grip on it to inhabit it with something approaching ease. Her eyes found me when I came into the room. The recognition was the same as it had always been. My face arriving in her vision and being received as the face the land had chosen her for. The face she had been wearing when she arrived in Hardin County in 1943, and that the Vassar photographs had been curating ever since. The recognition was familiar to me now. I had stopped finding it unsettling, and had begun finding it something else. Something that did not have a simple name. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of the specific connection between two people who share a face across time and circumstance, who have both been inside the same system and come out of it in different conditions, but still recognizably themselves. I sat across from her and put a paper bag on the table between us. She looked at the bag. Inside was a small, framed photograph, not one of the dark wood frames from the Vassar farmhouse, nothing that carried the weight of the curation and the arrangement in the 180 years, a simple silver frame, the kind sold in any drugstore, and inside it a photograph I had printed from the county recorder's digitized archive, the 1943 Hardin County Courier notice announcing Alma Greer's arrival in the county, describing her as a young woman of good character recently arrived from out of county. 4 sentences, her name, her origin, her arrival. The smallest possible documentary record of a person who had come to a county in 1943 and had been kept there until the previous October. I set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a long time. Her left hand moved on the wheelchair armrest, the hand that had recovered more function than the right. The hand that had been developing its vocabulary of gesture over the months since the removal, and after a moment it moved to the frame and touched it, one finger tracing the silver edge, then the glass, then the printed text below the photograph that named her. I said, "That is who you were when you arrived." She looked at me. I said, "I thought you should have a record of that, something that says you were a person who came from somewhere, before any of the rest of it." Her face worked. It had been working since October, developing its range, recovering the capacity for expression that the keeping had reduced to its most minimal form. What arrived now was not the trying to smile of the clearing, or the full smile of the hospital room. It was something slower and more considered, an expression I did not have an immediate category for, and that I sat with for a moment before I understood it. She was looking at the photograph of herself, the way you look at something you have not seen in a very long time, and that you had not been certain of still existed. The way you look at evidence of a self that predates the thing that changed you, not with grief for the loss of it, exactly, but with the specific recognition of a person confirming that they were once someone, that there was a before, that the before is not gone simply because the after has been so long, so consuming. She was looking at her own history. I had brought it to her, the smallest piece of it, 4 sentences in a county newspaper from 81 years ago, and it was the piece she needed in the way that patients sometimes need one specific thing that the medical team has not thought of, that exists outside the framework of treatment and prognosis and recovery protocols, that the nurse notices and provides because the nurse is paying attention to what is actually there. We sat together in the March light for the rest of the visiting hour. I talked and she listened, using her hand to confirm or query. The the vocabulary between us developing the way any shared vocabulary develops, through use, through the small adjustments of two people learning each other's language in real time. I told her about the legal proceedings, which were moving forward in the way of legal proceedings in significant cases, slowly, with many stops and returns, with a gravity that the pace honored rather than undermined. I told her that the journalists' reporting had generated the kind of attention that produced additional investigation, that what had been uncovered at the Vassar farm had led to inquiries into similar arrangements in 2 other Mississippi counties, which I had not known and which I sat with for a moment after I said it. She listened. Her hand moved. Her face moved. When the visiting hour ended, I stood and said I would come back, which I said every time, and meant every time. She looked at me with the expression she had been developing since the rehabilitation facility, the one that was neither the vigilance of the field nor the exhausted relief of the early hospital. Weeks, but something that belonged to this stage, to the stage of a person actively becoming what they are going to be next, which was a stage I did not have a name for, but that I recognized from nursing as the stage that follows stabilization and precedes whatever constitutes, for any given patient, the closest available version of well. I picked up my jacket from the chair back and the paper bag from the table and walked to the door. At the door I turned back. She was still looking at the framed notice. Her left hand was resting on the table beside it, not touching it now, just beside it, the way a person rests their hand beside something they want to be near without needing to hold. Her name in 4 sentences in a county newspaper from 1943. Alma Greer, recently arrived from out of county. I drove north out of Clarksdale on Route 61, the delta opening on both sides of the highway and the March flatness that precedes planting season. The fields bare and dark, the rich black soil turned and waiting. The sky, the specific March gray that is neither winter nor spring, but the color of a season deciding. The Bradford pears along the highway shoulders were in their brief white bloom, the kind of bloom that lasts a week and then is gone, unreliable and extravagant and entirely indifferent to whether anyone is there to see it. I drove with the window down. The delta air came through, cold still at this altitude of the season, carrying the turned earth smell of fields being prepared for what would grow in them, the ordinary mineral smell of soil doing its ordinary work, which was what soil did when it was not doing anything else, which was all it was doing now in the fields I was passing. All they were now, ordinary land in an ordinary march, the abundance ahead of them rather than behind, not yet earned, not yet present, just possible in the way that anything is possible before the season begins. I passed the Hardin County line without noting the exact moment of it. The Vassar property appeared on the left side of the highway at the point where the county road branched off. The locked gate visible from the highway. The field behind it cut and flat and dark under the March sky. The circle at the center of it slightly darker still. The place where the earth had been fed for a very long time and that was now simply earth again, or as close to simply earth as a place like that could come. I did not slow down. I looked at it as I passed, the way I had looked at it every time I drove this road in the months since October, with the specific attention of a person confirming that something is still what it last was, that the numbers have not changed, that the field is still cut and ordinary and no longer producing what it had been producing when Alma was in it. Then I was past it, and the road went on, and the delta went on both sides of the road, and I drove north with the window down and the cold March air coming through and the Bradford pears blooming along the shoulders and their extravagant brief white, and the turned earth on both sides, carrying its ordinary mineral smell, the smell of a season that has not yet decided what it will grow, the smell of a place where something is about to begin. Story 2. The Man in Every Frame. What would you do if you discovered a stranger in the background of every photograph you ever took at a wedding? The ceremony, the reception, the hotel lobby. Someone who was never invited, never noticed and yet was there in every single frame? Nora Voss is a professional wedding photographer in Portland, Oregon. She is precise, careful, and very good at her work. She does not miss things in her own photographs. She missed him for 4 weeks. When she finally looked, really looked, she found a man in a navy suit standing at the edge of 7 different frames, across 3 separate locations, across a single wedding day. Always still, always watching, always just outside the center of the shot, as if he knew exactly where the camera would find him and had chosen to stay 1 step beyond it. The suit had been hanging in the dry cleaning shop below her studio for 11 months. Its owner had died before he could pick it up. But he had kept the ticket. This is a story about what we leave unfinished, about the things that wait for us when we cannot wait for themselves, and about a photographer who spent 9 years learning to record the world, and one October who finally learned to see it. The Calloway wedding was the kind of job that should have been simple. I want to be clear about that because I have spent the months since trying to identify the precise moment things stopped being simple, and I keep returning to the same place. A Tuesday evening in October, my studio, a glass of wine going warm on the desk beside me, and the first pass through 412 photographs that should have contained nothing except 2 people and their happiness. My name is Nora Voss. I have been a wedding photographer for 9 years. Before that, I shot editorial work for 2 magazines that no longer exist. And before that, I studied documentary photography at a school in Boston where my professor told me, in a critique that I still hear in my sleep, that my instinct was to record rather than to see. I have spent 9 years trying to prove him wrong. I record light, I record timing, I record the specific angle of a jaw when a person laughs without knowing they are being photographed. What I do not do is miss things in my own frames. I missed him in the first pass entirely. The Calloway wedding had been held at the Multnomah County Courthouse, followed by a reception at a converted warehouse space in the Pearl District. 112 guests. A ceremony that lasted 22 minutes. A reception that ran until 11 at night, at which point the couple left in a car decorated with shaving cream and tin cans. Then I drove home with a memory card of 412 images, and the particular pleasant exhaustion of a job well executed. I began culling on Tuesday. This is the unglamorous part of the work. The hours of comparative assessment, keeping the sharp and the felt, discarding the blinks and the turned heads and the ambient shots that serve the moment, but do not serve the album. I had my second monitor running the rejected stack and my primary screen showing the keepers, and I was moving through them with a kind of professional autopilot. The wine not quite forgotten but not quite present either, and the rain outside doing what October rain in Portland does, which is fall with a quiet and steady conviction that it has always been falling and always will. The first time I saw the man in the navy suit, I did not see him. I mean this precisely. He was in the frame, and I looked at the frame, and I did not register him. My eye went to what had been trained to go to. The bride's expression at the moment the groom's voice broke during his vows. The quality of the light through the courthouse's tall windows, the way the maid of honor had her hand pressed against her mouth. I called the image as a keeper and moved on. It was on the third pass, the detail review, where I zoomed to 100% and checked for focus on the primary subjects, that I noticed something in the background of frame 217, a man standing in the row of courthouse observers behind the seated guests. Navy suit, well cut, the kind that reads as expensive without being ostentatious. Dark tie. His face was slightly turned from the camera, not enough to be deliberately avoidant, just enough that I could see the line of his jaw and the close-cropped gray at his temples and not quite his eyes. He was standing very still in a row where everyone else was shifting, leaning, taking out their phones. I noted him and moved on. Courthouse weddings draw observers. It is one of the things I find quietly moving about the location. Strangers pausing on their way to traffic court or filing offices, stopping to watch 2 people make a decision that will change the entire architecture of their lives. The man in the navy suit could have been anyone. He could have been a lawyer between hearings. He could have been a man who had once stood exactly where the groom was standing and wanted to look at that moment again through someone else's experience of it. I moved to the reception frames and forgot about him. It was late, maybe 11 or close to it, when I cycled back to cross-reference a lighting anomaly in the ceremony frames and pulled up the wide shot of the reception hall. It was a room establishing image, the kind I shoot on arrival to document the space before guests fill it. The caterers were still arranging glassware. The light was warm and slightly amber from the Edison bulb chandeliers the venue favored. In the far left corner of the frame, behind a column, standing very still in the way that a person stands when they are watching something rather than doing something, was a man in a navy suit. I told myself it was a member of the venue staff. I told myself it was a wedding guest who had arrived early. I told myself the suit simply looked similar under amber light, and that I was tired, and that the detailed review had made my eyes unreliable. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and went to bed. I did not sleep well. I kept thinking about my professor's critique, which I had not thought about in years. I kept thinking about the specific quality of stillness in both frames, the courthouse and the reception hall. The way the figure occupied the space around him differently from every other person in the image, as if the other people were moving through time and he was simply present in it, not before and not after, just permanently, stubbornly there. In the morning, I opened the laptop and ran the full sequence from the beginning. He was in frame 31. He was in frame 88. He was in frame 144. Which was a photograph I had taken in the hotel lobby an hour before the ceremony, when I was doing the bridal preparation shots, a room that should have contained only the wedding party and myself. He was in frame 217, which I already knew. He was in frame 290 and 306 and 351. The same man, the same suit. In every image, standing at the edge of the frame, never looked directly at the camera. Never quite fully in the shot. 7 photographs across a 12-hour day at 3 separate locations. My mouth had gone completely dry. I noticed, distantly, that I was holding my breath. I noticed the sound of traffic from Alberta Street below, and the faint, chemical smell of solvent that rose from the dry cleaner on the ground floor when they ran the machines in the morning. I told myself there was an explanation. I sat at my desk for a very long time, looking at frame 31, which was the first one. The hotel lobby. An hour before the ceremony, a room I had been in and could see fully from wall to wall. He was in the background, half behind a lobby pillar, in the spot where there had not been anyone standing when I pressed the shutter. I told myself there was an explanation, and I kept telling myself that, but the telling got quieter with every frame I looked at, until by frame 351, the voice doing the telling had gone entirely silent. The photographs sat open on my screen all of that Wednesday, all 7 frames arranged in a grid, and I kept returning to them between client emails and the phone call about a November booking, pulling up the grid and looking at it until my eyes went soft, and then closing it again. By afternoon, I had a working list of rational explanations that I had written in my notebook in the careful, deliberate handwriting I use when I need to feel organized. The list said, staff member at multiple venues, possible, unlikely. Guest who knew all 3 locations, possible, but, explain the lobby. Photobombing, deliberate or accidental. Explain the stillness, explain 7 frames. Equipment artifact, lens flare, reflection, pareidolia. Explain the detail, explain the suit, explain the consistency. Editing error, multiple images composited incorrectly. I do not composite images, have never composited images, would know if I had. I crossed out each item as I examined it and found it insufficient. What I was left with was the photographs. I want to describe what is actually in them because the describing matters and I have not been precise enough about it yet. In frame 31, the hotel lobby, he is standing behind the pillar to the left of the elevator bank. The pillar is marble, cream-colored, and it cuts him at the shoulder so that you see the left half of his body and the suggestion of the right. His left hand is at his side. His jacket is a true navy, not dark blue, not charcoal navy, the kind of color that photographs with a slight richness that lighter blues do not. The tie is darker, almost black. His posture is the posture of a person who is comfortable being still, which is different from the posture of a person who is trying to be still. There is no tension in the visible shoulder. In frame 88, the ceremony, a wide shot of the guests during the vows. He is in the third row from the back, standing when everyone else is seated. The Callaways had general seating, not assigned, and the third row from the back had space at the aisle end where he is standing. He is turned approximately 40 degrees from the camera. I can see more of his face in this frame than in any other. The jaw, the cheekbone, the gray at his temple. His eyes are directed toward the front of the room, toward the couple, and there is something about the angle of his attention that I keep coming back to and cannot name. It is not the way a person looks at something that interests them. It is the way a person looks at something they are waiting for. I did not call the Callaways that day. I want to be honest about why. I was afraid of what they would say, and I was more afraid of what they would not say. Instead, I went downstairs. The dry cleaner on the ground floor of my building is called Alderman's, and it has been there for as long as I have rented the studio above it, which is 6 years. The man who runs it is named Gerald, and he is in his mid-60s, thin and precise in the way of people who work with small, exacting details all day. And he has a habit of looking slightly past the person he is speaking to, as if there is something of interest on the wall behind them. I've exchanged perhaps 200 words with Gerald in 6 years. Most of them are concerned about the smell of the solvent coming through the floor and whether the ventilation can be adjusted. I went down because I needed to be in a space that was not my studio, and because the smell of the solvent, which normally bothered me, felt that morning like something grounding and chemical and real. Gerald was pressing a suit behind the counter, navy blue. I stopped in the doorway. He looked up and then passed me at the wall and said, "Miss Voss." I said I was just stopping in. He said, "Is there something with the ventilation again?" I said no, and then I said, because the suit was there and I was looking at it. "Do you ever get suits like that one goes unclaimed?" Gerald looked at the suit on the press. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Every cleaner does." I asked what happened to them. He said, "Depends on how long they sit." He moved the press arm. Anything over 60 days, we are allowed to dispose or donate. I asked if he had ever had one seat longer than that. He set the press arm back in its rest position and looked at me directly, which he almost never does, and said, "Was there something specific you needed, Miss Voss?" It was not a question. The period at the end of it was audible. I said no. I said sorry to interrupt. I went back upstairs. I sat at my desk and looked at the grid of 7 photographs and thought about the way Gerald had looked at me when I asked about unclaimed suits. Not the look of a person who finds a question strange. The look of a person who finds a question familiar and has decided not to answer it. I pulled up the metadata on frame 31, timestamp 9:47 in the morning. Location data, the hotel on Southwest Broadway where the Callaway bridal party had booked their preparation rooms. I had been in that lobby for 11 minutes before I went upstairs to begin the preparation shots. In 11 minutes, I had taken 6 frames of the lobby space for my own reference. He was one of them. I looked at the suit on my screen. Then I looked at the window and the street below, and the sign for Alderman's dry cleaning hanging above the door. The solvent smell was stronger than usual. I noticed this and then noticed that I'd been noticing it for some time without registering it. I opened a browser and searched for Alderman's dry cleaning and found a business listing with an address, a phone number, and no website. I found a Yelp page with 4 reviews, the most recent from 3 years ago, which said, "Good work, quick turnaround, a little cold, but nothing wrong with that." I found in a local business registry from 2014 a record of the business operating under a previous name, Veterans Dry Cleaning, Alderman's, sole proprietor Gerald Roth. I read the surname twice. Then I searched for the name Stanley Roth in Portland, Oregon, and found an obituary from October of the previous year, 11 months before the Callaway wedding. Stanley Roth, 61, of Northeast Portland, preceded in death by his wife, no children listed. A career in textile services, survived by a brother, Gerald. The obituary did not include a photograph. I closed the browser. My hands were doing something I would not call shaking, but that was not entirely still. I thought about Gerald saying anything. Over 60 days we are allowed to dispose of or donate. I thought about Stanley Roth's Navy suit, which had been hanging in Alderman's for 11 months. 11 months waiting. And somewhere in the back of my mind the thought I was not yet ready to finish. Waiting for what exactly? And waiting for whom? I went to the desk drawer and took out the external drive and held it in both hands and sat very still. The way the man in the photographs was always still, and I listened to the rain against the north-facing window and the faint mechanical sound of Gerald's press cycling through its heat on the floor below me. The wine from Tuesday night was still on the desk. I had not moved it. The glass had left a pale ring on the wood that I kept meaning to wipe away. I did not wipe it away. I sat with the drive in my hands and thought about a man who had left a suit to be pressed for a Friday work function and died on a Wednesday. And I thought about what it means to leave something somewhere with the full intention of returning for it and then to not return, and whether the intention stays in the place you left it even after you are gone. I did not have an answer. What I had was 7 photographs and a surname and a drive sitting in my hands in the gray October light, and the feeling that I was holding something much heavier than its size suggested. I sent the Callaways their gallery on Thursday, with the 7 frames removed. I told myself this was to protect the quality of the album. I kept the originals on a separate drive, labeled with a date and nothing else, and put the drive in my desk drawer under a lens cap and a spare battery in a takeout menu I had been meaning to throw away for months. The urge to look at the driver was specific and physical. It sat in my chest, just below the sternum, the way a cough sits before it comes. Friday, I booked a consultation for a spring wedding in Cannon Beach and responded to 3 emails and ate lunch standing at the kitchen window watching Alberta Street, and noticed that I was watching Alderman's specifically, its glass front door and the row of hanging garments visible through the window like pale, headless figures waiting in a queue. I told myself I was being fanciful. I made tea, which I did not drink, and sat back at the desk and opened the drive. I want to explain why I went back to it, because the reason is not simply curiosity and it is not simply fear. It is something closer to the feeling I get when I know a photograph is almost right but not finished. When something in the composition is unresolved and the eye keeps returning to it not because it is beautiful, but because it is incomplete. The 7 frames had that quality. They were asking a question that the rest of the album could not answer, and I am constitutionally unable to leave a question in a frame without pursuing it to the edge of what the frame will show me. So I went back. I had been thinking, in the nights between, about something my professor had said in a different context. Not the critique about recording versus seeing, but a comment he had made about documentary photography and what he called the ethics of what the frame refuses to show. He meant that every photograph has an edge, and that the horror of documentary work is not always in what is inside the frame, but in what has been left outside it. What the photographer chose not to include or did not notice in time. 7 frames. In each one, the man was at the edge. In each one, there was something outside the frame that I could not see. I pulled up frame 144 again, the hotel lobby, bridal preparation, and cropped it hard to the figure. The face was turned away as always, but in this frame, for the first time, I noticed something I had missed in every earlier review. His left hand, which was at his side, was holding something, a small rectangle, pale-colored, between 2 fingers. I had taken it for a business card in my first examination. Looking at the crop now, at full magnification, I could see the slight curl at one end that business cards do not have. It was a dry cleaning ticket. I sat with that for a long time. The pink paper, the slight curl from being folded into a pocket and removed many times. I could not read the number on it at any level of zoom. The resolution and the angle conspired against me. But I knew the shape of those tickets because I had one in my own coat pocket at that moment, from dropping off a jacket the week before. I took the ticket from my pocket and held it next to the screen. The same shape, the same slight translucence, the same curl at the end from being handled. I sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The solvent smell was coming up through the floor the way it always did in the mornings. It was afternoon now, and it was still there, faint but present. The way certain things are present that you have stopped consciously registering, but that are shaping the quality of the air around you regardless. I opened a browser tab and navigated back to the Oregon State Business Registry. I'd found the listing for Veterans Dry Cleaning, Alderman's, sole proprietor Gerald Roth 2 days before. Now I went deeper into the archive, back through the filing dates, and found a secondary registration from 1991. A co-proprietorship. 2 names. Gerald Roth and Stanley Roth, brothers, running it together. And then at some point 1 name, and then the rename. I searched for Stanley Roth again, this time adding Textile and Kankakee County, and then stopped myself because I had gotten the counties confused, and this was Portland, this was Oregon, and I was tired enough that geography was blurring. I cleared the search and typed it correctly. Stanley Roth, Portland, Textile Services. The obituary came up again. I read it more carefully this time, the way you read something the second time, when you suspect the first reading was not thorough. The obituary said, preceded in death by his wife, Caroline. No children were listed. I am a career in textile services. Survived by a brother, Gerald. No children were listed. I had taken that phrase at face value on the first reading, the way you take phrases in obituaries at face value, because they are written by people in grief, who are making choices about what to include and what to fold away. No children listed was not the same as no children. I knew this because I had attended enough events in my professional life to understand that families are not always the clean, documented things that official paperwork suggests. No children listed meant someone had made a decision about what to put in print and what to leave out. I closed the laptop. My jaw was aching. I had been clenching it without noticing. A thing I do when I am turning a problem over and not allowing myself to acknowledge that it is a problem. I pressed my fingers against the joint and felt the dull complaint of a muscle that had been working without permission. I thought about the ticket in the frame. I thought about what it meant to carry a ticket for something you had left somewhere with the intention of returning for it. The ticket was the proof of the intention. It was the physical record of an errand interrupted. It was the one thing you would keep if you wanted to come back, even if coming back had become, in the intervening time, more complicated than anyone had planned. I got up and stood at the window and looked at Alderman's sign below. The letters were the plain, practical font of a business that had been operating long enough not to need to advertise its aesthetic. The door was closed. The lights were on inside. There was one more thing I needed to know, and I could not find it in a registry or an obituary or a browser tab. I needed to know what Stanley Roth had left unfinished, and the only person who might tell me was 1 floor below, pressing garments in a shop that smelled of solvent and patience, and who had looked at me 2 days ago with the expression of a man who was very practiced at not answering questions that he recognized. I picked up my coat. I checked the pocket out of habit. The dry cleaning ticket was still in there. I left it where it was and went downstairs. I went to Gerald on Monday morning. I want to be honest about what I was feeling walking down those stairs, because the feelings matter and I have a habit of omitting them when I write about things that frighten me. I was not brave. I was not conducting an investigation. I was a person who had found something in her photographs that she could not put away and could not explain. and who had landed on the most direct available path toward an explanation, and was walking down it because the alternative was to keep sitting upstairs with the drive in the desk drawer, and the solvent smell coming through the floor and the 7 frames open on a screen she kept returning to without meaning to. The shop was empty of customers. Gerald was at the back, sorting garments on the long motorized rod, working through the hanging bags with the systematic attention of a person who has performed the same task so many thousands of times that the hands know it without the mind needing to supervise. He heard the bell above the door and came to the counter without hurrying. I put my phone on the counter with frame 144 open. The crop. The figure with the pink ticket between 2 fingers, I said. I found this in a photograph I took at the Calloway wedding last month. I need you to tell me what it is. Gerald looked at the photograph for a long time. His expression did not change. This is the thing I keep returning to. Not what he said, but the quality of his stillness while he looked at the image, which was the same quality of stillness I had seen in the frames, in the man in the suit, and which I now understood was not a habit, but a family characteristic, something carried in the body across generations like a bone structure or a vocal register. He said, "Where exactly was this taken?" I said the hotel lobby on Southwest Broadway. I said 9:47 in the morning. I said there had been no one standing in that spot when I pressed the shutter. He said, "And the other frames?" I said, "How do you know there are other frames?" He looked past me at the garment bags hanging in the window. The pale shapes of them, backlit by the gray morning outside, shifting almost imperceptibly in the air from the heating vent. Then he picked at my phone and looked at the crop for another moment, and set it back down with the care of a person returning something that does not belong to them. He said, "Stanley came in on Tuesday. This would be 11 months ago now. Left his suit for pressing. His good one, navy, for a work function he had that Friday." He paused. "He died on Wednesday." I waited. Gerald said, "The suit sat." I kept thinking someone would come for it. His things were handled by an estate lawyer, and I kept waiting for the lawyer to send someone, or to call at least. He straightened the pen beside the register with one finger, a small and careful adjustment. Nobody came. I said, "The ticket in the photograph." He said the ticket was in the pocket when he dropped it off. He would have needed it to claim the garment. Another pause, the kind that has weight in it. "They always keep the ticket." I asked him what he meant by they. He said, "People who are waiting. People who have left something somewhere and are not finished with the leaving." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the counter rather than at me or past me. "I have been in this business for 31 years. You learn to recognize when a garment is occupied and when it is not." I said, "Occupied." He said, "Waiting garments are different from unclaimed ones. An unclaimed garment is just fabric. A waiting garment." He stopped. He tried again. Stanley had unfinished things. He was going to the work function for a reason. Something he needed to settle. Someone he needed to see face to face. And then he died on Wednesday, and the suit stayed, and the thing he needed to settle stayed with it. I looked at the motorized rack behind him, the garment bags hanging in their long pale row, each one tagged, each one waiting for a number to be called and a ticket to be produced and a transaction to be completed. I counted perhaps 40 bags visible from where I was standing, perhaps more behind the bend in the rack. I asked how many of the bags on that rack were waiting rather than unclaimed. Gerald looked at the rack. He was quiet for long enough that I became aware of the sound of the press cycling somewhere in the back room, its rhythmic mechanical exhale, and the rain beginning again against the front window. When he spoke, his voice was careful and flat in the way of a person, measuring exactly what they are releasing and what they are keeping back. He said, "More than I would like. I thought about the Calloways and their wedding day, 12 hours across 3 locations, and a man in a navy suit attending every moment of it, with the quiet and absolute attention of someone who had somewhere he needed to be, and something he needed to finish before he could rest. I thought about what Stanley Roth had needed to settle. I asked Gerald if he knew what it was. He said, "I know that he had a son." He said it the way a person says a fact they have held for a long time without knowing what to do with it, the way you set something heavy down on a surface and step back from it. The obituary said, "No children." That was not accurate. The bell above the door rang. A woman came in with a winter coat folded over her arm, and Gerald straightened and turned toward her with the practiced, neutral courtesy of a man returning to his professional register. And I picked up my phone from the counter and stepped back, and then stepped out through the door into the rain. I stood on Alberta Street for a long time. The rain was the particular fine kind that Portland produces in late October, not dramatic enough to require an umbrella, but persistent enough to make every surface slowly darken. My coat was getting wet across the shoulders. I did not move. I was thinking about Ryan Calloway. I was thinking about his intake form, which I had read 3 times during the preparation process and which I now understood I had not read carefully enough. I was thinking about what he had written in the biographical section, the part where I ask couples to tell me something they want the album to reflect. He had written about growing up moving around, about losing contact with his father when he was young, about a reconnection that had come too late. He had written, "This wedding is partly about learning to stay in one place." A father he had lost contact with. A reconnection that had come too late. I looked up at my studio window 2 floors above Alderman's sign, and then I looked at the sign itself, and then I looked at the garment bags visible through the glass of the shop front, pale and still and waiting in their row. Stanley Roth had a son. Stanley Roth had died on a Wednesday with a navy suit at the cleaners and a Friday work function he never attended, and something unfinished that had kept him tethered to a garment bag in his brother's shop for 11 months. And then his son had gotten married. The rain came down. The garment bags did not move. Somewhere behind me a car passed through a puddle and the sound of it was very loud and then gone. I took out my phone and opened the Calloway client file and found the wedding invitation I had photographed for my records during the planning process, the cream card stock with the letterpress printing, and I turned it over in the image to read the back, which I had never looked at before because the back of a wedding invitation is not something a photographer has reason to document. There was a line of italic text, a memorial acknowledgement, the kind that couples include for the people they carry with them into the ceremony. It said, "We carry you with us," and then a single name, Stanley. I stood in the rain on Alberta Street and read the name twice, and then put my phone in my pocket and stood very still, the way the man in the photographs was always still, and felt the specific and enormous weight of understanding something that had been true the entire time, and that I had simply not yet looked at carefully enough to see. The wedding invitation was cream-colored cardstock with letterpress printing, and I had been looking at the front of it for a month. I want to say that plainly because the plainness of it is the thing that stays with me. The information had been in my files since the first planning consultation. The name had been on the back of a document I had photographed and filed and opened perhaps a dozen times in the preparation process, and I had never turned it over in my mind the way I had never turned it over in the image, because the back of a wedding invitation is not where a photographer looks. I look at the front, I look at the names, the date, the location. I look at what is presented for looking. I have been thinking about that ever since, about how much goes unseen not because it is hidden, but because we have decided without quite deciding where the frame ends. I went back upstairs and opened the invitation image on my primary screen and rotated it, and read the full text on the back for the first time. The brief note from the couple, the line about gratitude, about those who had traveled to be there, about those who could only be there in spirit. And then the memorial acknowledgement in italics, a single name below the text, Stanley, no last name, just Stanley, remembered, carried. I sat at the desk for a long time without moving. The tea I had made that morning was cold at my elbow. Outside the rain had softened, to the kind that you feel more than hear, a general dampening of the air rather than a sound with a source. I noticed that my hands were folding in my lap, which is not a thing I usually do when I am sitting at a desk. It is the posture of a person in a waiting room, a person who has arrived somewhere and is waiting to be told what happens next. I went back through my pre-wedding consultation notes and found the biographical section. Ryan Calloway had written it in the text field I provide, the open prompt that asks couples to share something they want the album to hold. Some people write 2 sentences. Ryan had written a paragraph. He wrote about moving, about the specific instability of a childhood spent in rental houses in 4 different states following a parent's work, never long enough anywhere to accumulate the kind of history that roots a person to a place. He wrote about his father, whom he described as brilliant and restless and difficult to hold on to, a man who moved through the world with the momentum of someone who had somewhere to be and had not yet arrived there. He wrote about losing contact when he was 14, and about finding his father again in his late 20s, and about the years between the finding and the losing again, that were not enough years and not the right kind. Years of partial conversations and rescheduled visits and things said almost and then not quite. He wrote, "I lost him before I could tell him what I needed to tell him. This wedding is partly about learning to stay in one place." I read it 3 times. Each time the sentence arranged itself differently in my mind, the way sentences do when you are reading them against information you did not have the first time. I lost him before I could tell him what I needed to tell him. And Stanley Roth had died on a Wednesday in October, with a Navy suit at the cleaners, and a Friday work function he had not attended, and a son whose name was not in his obituary. A son who had gotten married a year later in a courthouse on Southwest Broadway, with his father's name in italic type on the back of the invitation, carried. I opened the 7 frames. I looked at frame 88 for a long time. The ceremony. The wide shot of the guests during the vows. Stanley in the 3rd row from the back, standing when everyone else was seated, his attention directed toward the front of the room. I had described that attention in my notes to myself as the way a person looks at something they are waiting for. I looked at it again now with the consultation notes open beside it, and I understood that I had been right about the waiting and wrong about the direction of it. He was not waiting for something to happen. He was watching something that was already happening, that he had arranged himself across 11 months and 3 locations and 7 frames to be present for. And the quality of his attention was not anticipation, but the specific and costly attention of a person who knows they have very little time left in which to look and is therefore looking with everything they have. I picked up my phone and called Ryan Calloway. He answered on the 3rd ring. There was background noise, the sound of a kitchen, something being set down on a counter. He said hello with the easy, unsuspecting warmth of a person who has no reason to brace for what is coming. I told him I had found some additional images in the full take that I had not included in the delivered gallery, and that I wanted to share them with him now. He said, "Sure. What are they?" I said they were background frames, ambient documentation, and that there was a figure in several of them that I thought he might recognize. There was a pause, not a long one, the kind of pause that lasts exactly as long as it takes a person to make a decision about how much they are going to acknowledge. Then he said, "What does he look like? Not who is it, not what kind of figure. What does he look like?" I described the suit, navy, well cut, the dark tie, the posture, the gray at the temples, the way the face was never quite turned toward the camera, always at an angle, always at the edge of what the frame would show. The kitchen sound stopped. I heard a door, soft, the particular sound of a person stepping into a room where they can be alone. When Ryan spoke again, his voice had changed. It had the texture of something being held very carefully in both hands. He said, That sounds like my dad, I said. I know. He was quiet. I waited. Outside my window, the rain had stopped entirely, and the sudden absence of it made the room feel larger and more still than it had been a moment before. He said very quietly, Does he look okay? I looked at frame 217. The ceremony. Stanley in the third row from the back, facing forward, watching his son stand at the front of the room and making the decision to stay. The quality of his attention was clear even at this distance, even across whatever distance the 7 frames represented. It was not the attention of a person who had arrived too late. It was the attention of a person who had arrived exactly when the thing he had come to see was happening. I said, "He looks like he is exactly where he wanted to be." Ryan did not say anything. I could hear his breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of a person managing something in real time. I heard, behind it, a sound I could not immediately identify, and then I understood it was the sound of a person pressing a hand against their mouth to hold something in. I held the phone and did not speak. The room was very quiet. The solvent smell was faint, but present as it always was, rising through the floor from Alderman's below with its patient, chemical constancy. I thought about Stanley Roth's suit hanging downstairs for 11 months in its garment bag, waiting. I thought about the pink ticket held between 2 fingers in frame 144. The proof of an intention, the physical record that a man had left something somewhere with the full plan of coming back for it. I thought about what it means to carry a ticket for something you can no longer claim with your hands, and whether the carrying of it is its own kind of returning. Ryan finally spoke. His voice was steadier than I expected. The steadiness of someone who has been practicing for a long time how to hold things that are too large for ordinary holding. He said, "Can I have them? The 7 frames?" I said yes. I said I would send them that evening. I said I was sorry it had taken me this long to look at them carefully enough to understand what they were. He said, "You looked at them. That is the part that matters." I sent them that evening, all 7, labeled in sequence with a short note that said only, "He was there for all of it." I put the external drive back in the desk drawer. Then I took it out again and set it on the desk surface in the open where I could see it. I did not close the laptop. I left frame 217 on the screen and let the room go dark around it as the evening came in, the gray Portland dark that arrives without announcement, and I sat with a glass of wine I did not particularly want and looked at the man in the third row looking at his son, and I thought about all the things we leave unfinished and all the ways we find, against every reasonable expectation, to finish them. 4 months have passed since October. The studio is the same. The rain comes the same way it always has, at a Portland angle, hitting the north-facing windows first, and then finding the gaps around the south-facing frame that I have been meaning to have sealed since I moved in. The solvent smell from Alderman's still rises in the mornings. I have stopped minding it the way I once did. It smells now, less like an intrusion and more like a signal. The building breathing, the day beginning, something below me going about the quiet work of making things clean. I sent Ryan Calloway the 7 frames the evening of our phone call. He acknowledged receipt with a message that said only, "Thank you." I received a card in the mail 2 weeks later, cream stock, handwritten, no printed design. It said, "We printed one of them. It is in our hallway now." He looks like he is listening, which is, Ryan wrote, exactly how he always was when he finally had his attention. "We did not know how to tell you that it meant everything, so we are just telling you. I have read that card many times. It lives in the file folder with the Calloway wedding materials behind the venue contract and the short list and the invitation with the italic name on the back. I do not file things in that folder anymore. I left it on the desk. I went back to Alderman's in January. I want to be honest about why, because my reasons were not entirely professional and not entirely personal, but somewhere in the territory between, where most of the true reasons for things tend to live. I went because I needed to know if the suit was still there. I had been thinking about it through November and December, through 2 other weddings and a portrait session, and the particular suspended quality of the weeks between Christmas and the New Year, when the city empties out and the studio is very quiet and the mind goes to the things it has been saving for a moment of stillness. I went on a Tuesday morning, which felt correct without my being able to say exactly why. Gerald was alone in the shop. He looked up when the bell rang and pasted me to the wall and said, "Miss Voss." I said I had a question. He waited. I asked if the navy suit was still in the shop. He looked at the motorized rack for a moment. The long row of pale garment bags in their patient sequence, and then he looked back at me and said, "No, it was claimed the week after the Calloway wedding." I asked who had claimed it. He said, "A woman, someone I did not recognize. She had the ticket." I thought about the pink ticket in frame 144, between 2 fingers, the curl at the end from being handled. I thought about how a ticket is a proof of intention, a record that you left something somewhere and plan to return, and how the returning does not always look the way you expect it to. I asked if the woman had signed for it. Gerald said, "They do not always sign." I looked at the rack. I counted the bags the way I had counted them in October, trying to hold each one in my attention for a moment before moving to the next. There were perhaps 40 visible from where I was standing, perhaps more behind the bend. I asked him the same question I had asked in October, the one he had answered with more than I would like. I asked how many of the bags on the rack were waiting rather than unclaimed. He looked at the rack for a long time. The press cycled in the back room, its patient exhale, the sound of heat being applied to fabric, of things being made smooth. He said, "Fewer than last month." I thought about what that meant and did not ask him to explain it, because I understood that he had told me what he was willing to tell me, and that the rest of it belonged to the space between what can be said and what can only be held. I thanked him. He nodded, the small, precise nod of the man returning to his work. I went back upstairs. I have shot 4 weddings since October. I review every frame with the same attention I always have, the same 3 passes, the same zoom to 100% on the detail review. I look at the backgrounds. I look at the edges of the frames. I look at the places where people stand still in rooms where people do not usually stand still. Most of the time there is nothing there. I want to be honest about the most of the time, because it is doing real work in that sentence. It is not all of the time. In a photograph from a November wedding at a venue in the West Hills, there is a figure in the background of a single frame, just one, unlike the Calloway 7, standing near a window that looks out over the city. An older woman in a dark dress, her face turned away, her attention directed toward the bride who is laughing at something the camera did not capture the cause of. She is at the edge of the frame. She is very still. I have not yet called the couple. I am trying to decide what it means to be the person who sees these things, and what the obligation of seeing them is, and whether the obligation is to report, or simply to hold and to wait for the right moment. My professor would say the obligation is always to report. He believed the frame was a form of accountability. I am no longer sure he was right about that. What I am sure of is this: the camera records what the eye refuses. That is not a failure of the eye. It is, I have come to think, a collaboration. The eye protecting the person from what they are not yet ready to hold, and the camera keeping it safe until they are. I have started believing that readiness is the whole work. A spring consultation is on my calendar, a couple getting married in September at a venue on the coast outside Cannon Beach. In the intake form, in the biographical section, one of them wrote, "We want the album to hold everyone who made us possible. The ones who are here and the ones who are not." I read that line several times when it came in. I wrote back and told them I would pay close attention. I meant it in every sense I know how to mean something. The file folder is on my desk. The Calloway materials are inside it. The contract, the shot list, The cream invitation with the italic name on the back. The printed card from Ryan that says he looks like he is listening. On top of the folder, I have placed the dry cleaning ticket from my own coat pocket. The one I took out and held up to the screen in October to compare the shape of it to the shape of the one in frame 144. I do not have a garment to claim with it. I kept it anyway. I am not sure yet what I am keeping it for. I have learned these past 4 months to be patient with that kind of not knowing. Some tickets are for things you have already picked up without realizing it. Some are for things that are still being made ready. Outside, Alberta Street is wet and lit and moving with the ordinary traffic of a city that does not know and does not need to know what is held in the buildings along its edges. Below me, Alderman's is open. The lights on behind the glass. The garment bags visible in their row. Some of them waiting and some of them not. And the difference is a thing you learn to feel rather than see. A thing the body knows before the mind catches up. I leave the light on now when I leave the studio. I did not used to do this. I tell myself it is practical. I tell myself it makes the building look occupied, which discourages the particular kind of attention that empty buildings attract. But the truth, and I have been trying to tell the truth throughout this account, is that I leave it on because of the 7 frames, and because of what Stanley Roth traveled 11 months in 3 locations to attend, and because it seems to me now that light is the least complicated thing we can offer to whatever is still finding its way. I leave it on and I go home and I sleep, mostly, and in the mornings the solvent smell comes up through the floor, and I make tea, and I sit at the desk and I open whatever I am working on, and I look at it carefully, the way I have always looked, and then I look at the edges. The edges are where the true things wait. Story 3. The skin of someone else. What if you reached into your pocket and pulled out a ticket with a dead man's name on it? A man you have never met, never heard of, dead for exactly 2 weeks, and the woman behind the counter was not surprised? Dennis Gilman is a careful, practical man. He works in procurement. He looks up things. He finds rational explanations and holds on to them with both hands because that is the kind of person he is and has always been. On an ordinary Tuesday in February, he walked into the dry cleaning shop he had used for 11 years to pick up his suit, and came out holding a pink ticket with a stranger's name on it, an unmarked card with a phone number on it, and a question he could not put down. He called the number. This is the story of what answered. It is also the story of a man named Grady who noticed something wrong with his brother the day he came home, something small and precise and impossible to name, something in the way the light sat differently in his eyes, and who spent 6 months telling himself he was imagining it before the thing wearing his brother's face made a mistake so small that only someone who loved the original would have caught it. 2 men, 2 cities, 1 network that has been running its quiet, patient machinery for longer than either of them has been alive. This is a story about what it costs to be replaced, and about the people who notice before it is too late. The ticket was wrong, and I knew it before I had finished reading it. I want to explain what I mean by wrong, because wrong is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and I owe it more precision than that. The ticket was pink, the standard kind. The carbonless copy variety that dry cleaners have been using since before I was born, with a number printed across the top and a space for the item description below. I had pulled it from the breast pocket of my jacket without looking at it, the way you pull anything from a pocket when you are standing at a counter and the person behind the counter is waiting. The number on the ticket matched the number on the garment bag hanging behind the clerk. The item description said, 1 navy suit, press only. The name at the bottom said Stanley Roth. My name is Dennis Gilman. I am 44 years old. I work in procurement for a mid-sized logistics company in Northwest Portland, and I have been bringing my suits to veterans dry cleaning on Northeast Burnside for 11 years. The suit in the bag was mine. I had dropped it off the previous Thursday. The ticket should have had my name on it, and it had someone else's, and the clerk, a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Gable, who had taken my suits for 11 years with the same pleasant efficiency with which she did everything, was looking at the ticket in my hand with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not confusion. That was the first thing I registered for and could not immediately account for. A wrong ticket in a transaction she had managed thousands of times should have produced confusion, or at minimum the mild professional concern of someone locating a clerical error. What her face was doing was not that. It was closer to recognition, the specific, resigned recognition of a person who has seen this before and knows what it means and wishes very much that it was happening to someone else. She said, "Where did you find that?" I said it was in my jacket pocket, the breast pocket, the inside one. I said I had brought the jacket in with the suit. She looked at the ticket. She looked at me. She looked at the ticket again. She said, "That is not possible." I told her I understood that, but there was. I said perhaps there had been a mix-up in the filing. Perhaps the tickets had been swapped at some point during the week. She took the ticket from my hand with the careful, minimal contact of a person handling something they do not want to touch. She looked at the number on it. She looked at the number on the garment bag. She set the ticket on the counter between us and took 2 steps back, which placed her against the row of hanging bags along the back wall, and she stood there for a moment with her hands pressed flat against the counter behind her. The shop smelled the way it always did, of solvent and warm fabric, and the faint sweetness of the pressing steam. A radio was playing somewhere in the back. The fluorescent lights made the pale garment bags glow faintly, rows of them, long and still. I said, "Mrs. Gable, is there a problem?" She said, "I need you to wait." She went to the back. I heard her voice, low, and then a pause, and then her voice again. I could not hear the words. The radio was playing something I did not recognize. I stood at the counter and looked at the pink ticket lying between us and thought about the name on it, Stanley Roth, and tried to remember if I had ever heard it. She came back carrying a small card, not a business card, or not the ordinary kind. It was heavier stock than a business card, cream-colored, the kind of card that communicates expense in the hand before the eye reads what is printed on it. She placed it on the counter beside the ticket and slid both toward me, not touching them, using the tips of her fingers at the edges. She said, "I'm going to give you your suit at no charge today. I am going to ask you not to come back to this shop, and I am going to ask you to call that number." I looked at the card. There was a phone number on it, printed in plain type. No name, no address, no business identifier. Just a number. I said, "What is this?" She said, "Please call it today. Before this evening." She paused. She was looking past me at the door, in the street visible through the glass. The expression on her face had not changed, and I understood then that it was not going to change, that whatever she was feeling had settled into a register so far below the surface that the surface itself had gone entirely still. "It is important that you call it today." I took the suit. I took the card. I left. On the sidewalk outside, the February air was cold enough to feel specific, with that particular edge that Portland air gets in the second month of the year when the rain pauses and the temperature drops and the city feels briefly provisional, as though it is deciding whether to continue. I stood on the sidewalk with the suit over my arm and the card in my hand and the pink ticket folded in my coat pocket, and I looked at the street. I was not frightened yet. I want to be clear about that, because what came later was so different from what I felt in that moment, that the contrast matters. What I felt on the sidewalk outside Veterans Dry Cleaning was the low, itching discomfort of something unresolved, the feeling of a conversation that had ended before it was finished, of a question asked and answered sideways. I thought about Stanley Roth. I had a habit, developed over 11 years of procurement work, of looking names up. It was not exactly a professional habit, and not exactly a personal one. More a reflex, the same reflex that makes you look twice at a figure in your peripheral vision. A name that should not be where it is demands to be located. I looked up Stanley Roth on my phone, standing on the sidewalk. The first result was an obituary. Portland, Oregon. I am 61 years old. Died 14 days prior. Survived by no immediate family. The suit in the garment bag over my arm felt heavier than it had a moment before. It had the same weight it always had. I knew this. A suit is a suit, and weight does not change because of information. But the knowledge of the weight was different. I was holding the pressed garment of a man who had been dead for 2 weeks. A man whose name had appeared in my pocket on a ticket I had not put there, and a shop I had walked into on an ordinary Tuesday to collect my own clothes. The card with the phone number was still in my hand. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, long enough that a woman walking past glanced at me with the mild, assessing look that pedestrians give to people who are standing still on a city street. Trying to determine what category of stillness this is, I put the card in my pocket. I picked up the suit. I told myself there was a rational explanation and that I would find it, because I have always been a person who finds rational explanations and holds on to them with both hands. I told myself this all the way to my car. I did not call the number that afternoon. I did not call it that evening. I set the card on my kitchen counter when I got home and made dinner, and watched something I cannot now remember on television, and went to bed. And in the morning the card was still there, cream-colored and expensive, with its plain row of numbers, and the suit was hanging in my closet, and the pink ticket with the wrong name was on my nightstand, because I had taken it from my pocket before bed, without thinking about why. Stanley Roth. I looked at the name in the morning light. I thought about Mrs. Gable's face, the stillness of it, the specific quality of her not being surprised. I picked up the card and called the number. The phone rang 4 times, and then a voice answered. I want to describe the voice carefully, because it is one of the details I have returned to most often in the months since, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, trying to find the angle that explains it. It was a man's voice, middle-aged, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who speaks precisely because they have learned that imprecision is expensive. Not warm, not cold, calibrated. The way a room is calibrated when someone has spent time getting the temperature exactly right. He said, "Mr. Gilman." Not hello. Not who is this, my name stated before I had said anything at all. I said, "Yes. Who am I speaking to?" He said, "That is not the important question right now." He paused. The deliberate pause of a person organizing what they are about to say, rather than searching for it. The important question is whether you are alone and whether you are somewhere you can speak without being overheard. I was in my car, parked outside my apartment building, which is where I had gone to make the call because something about the kitchen counter, the ordinary domestic surface of it, had felt wrong for this particular conversation. I told him I was alone. He said, "Good. I am going to tell you some things that will be difficult to hear, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Can you do that?" I said I could. He said, "The ticket you found in your pocket was placed there. Not by Mrs. Gable and not by any employee of that shop. It was placed there by the process, which is what we call it internally, for reasons that will become clear. Your name has been in our system for some time. The ticket appearing in your pocket means that the process has moved to the next stage, which is contact. You are being contacted now." I said, "What process? What system? Who are we?" He said, "I asked you to let me finish." There was something in his voice when he said it that was not a threat and was not a request. It was a correction, the kind a teacher gives to a student who has interrupted something important. I closed my mouth. He said, "The organization I represent has been operating in this city and in 11 other cities across the country for a considerable number of years. We use dry cleaning establishments as what we call stations. This is a practical choice. Dry cleaners handle garments. Garments are intimate objects, and intimate objects carry information that more obvious surveillance methods cannot access. Mrs. Mensa, Gable has been a station manager for 19 years. She is very good at her work. The fact that she gave you the card rather than the alternative means she believes you are someone who can be spoken to rather than processed. I am inclined to agree with her assessment, which is why you are receiving this call instead of a visit. I said, processed. A pause. Then, that is the word we use. Yes. I looked through the windshield at my apartment building. On the second floor, third window from the left, my kitchen light was on. I had left it on when I came downstairs. The window looked exactly as it always looked. The ordinary lit rectangle of a room containing a counter, a coffee maker, a card that had been sitting on the surface until 20 minutes ago. I said, "What does process mean?" He said, "It means selected for replacement." He said it the way a person says something they have said many times, with the flatness that comes from repetition rather than indifference. There is a distinction between the two outcomes, contact and processing, and the distinction matters a great deal. People who are contacted have, in our assessment, the capacity to understand what the organization does and to make an informed decision about their relationship to it. People who are processed do not receive a call. They receive a visit, and the visit is the last ordinary thing that happens to them. The car was cold. I had not started the engine. I could see my own breath, faint, in the air in front of me. I said, "Stanley Roth was processed." He said, "Yes." I said, "He has been dead for 2 weeks." He said, 14 days, yes. He was processed efficiently. His garment was retained at the station as a procedural record. The ticket remained with him, as it always does. The fact that it appeared in your pocket is the part I cannot fully explain to you, because it is the part that falls outside the operational parameters of the organization. It should not have been possible for the ticket to be transferred. We are looking into it. I thought about the pink ticket in my coat pocket, which was in my apartment upstairs, on the nightstand, with Stanley Roth's name on it in plain printed type. I thought about Mrs. Gable's face, the stillness of it, the resigned and particular quality of a person seeing something familiar. I said, "What do you want from me?" He said, "Nothing yet. This call is informational." He paused. "There is someone I would like you to speak with. A man in the city who contacted us some months ago under similar circumstances, who has direct experience of what the organization does and how it operates. He is not an employee. He is, in our terminology, an aware civilian. His name is Grady Mercer. I am going to give you his number, and I am going to ask you to call him before you do anything else, before you speak to anyone about this conversation, before you go to the police, before you go back to the shop. He will give you a context that I am not well positioned to provide." I said, "Why are you not well positioned to provide it?" He said, "Because the context is personal, and personal information lands differently when it comes from someone who has lived it, rather than someone who administers it." He said it without any particular feeling. "I am an administrator, Mr. Gilman. Grady Mercer is a person who looked at his brother across a dinner table one evening and understood, in the way that you understand things that your mind does not want to be true, that the man sitting across from him was not his brother." The line was quiet for a moment. Then he gave me a number and ended the call without saying goodbye, which I noticed only in the silence after, the way you notice the absence of a sound you had grown accustomed to. I sat in the cold car. The kitchen window on the second floor was still lit. The light had not changed. Everything from outside looked exactly as it should look, the ordinary lit geometry of an ordinary apartment on an ordinary February evening, and I sat and looked at it and felt, for the first time since the dry cleaning counter, something that I was not willing to call fear, but that occupied the same territory. I thought about what he had said, about a man who had looked at his brother and understood that the man sitting across from him was not his brother. I thought about what that understanding would feel like, the specific quality of it, the moment before you name it, when the mind is holding two contradictory truths and has not yet decided which one to put down. I thought about the word replacement, I took out my phone and looked at Grady Mercer's number for a long time before I called it. And while I looked at it, I watched the kitchen window on the second floor and thought about the coffee maker on the counter and the card that was no longer there, and all the ordinary objects of an ordinary life arranged in their ordinary positions. And I wondered for the first time, and not the last, whether ordinary was a condition that could be revoked without the person inside it knowing. I called the number. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. He said, "You got my number from the man with the calibrated voice." I said, "Yes." He said, "Then you already know more than you want to." He paused. "It gets worse from here. I want to tell you that up front, because nobody told me, and I think someone should have." He had a steady voice. The steadiness of someone who has already been through the worst of something and is now living in the aftermath, which has its own kind of weight but is at least a known weight. He spoke the way people speak when they have told a story enough times that the telling has become its own kind of armor. He said, "Let me tell you about my brother Colton." I said, "Okay." He said, "It started with the wedding ring." Grady Mercer had a voice that made you want to trust it, which was, as he told me later, one of the cruelest ironies of everything that had happened to him, because trust was the precise instrument that had been used against him, honed and applied with the patience of something that had been practicing for a very long time. He started with the wedding ring, and I left him. He said, Colton came back from a work trip in early September. He had been gone 11 days, which was longer than usual, but not unusually long. Colton worked in agricultural supply and did seasonal runs through the eastern part of the state, sometimes into Idaho. Long drives through flat country with overnight stops in towns that had one motel and a gas station, and not much else. I had watched him come back from dozens of those trips. I knew what coming back looked like for my brother. The way he dropped his bag at the door before he took his boots off, the way he went for the refrigerator before he said hello to anyone, the way he stood in the kitchen of his own house and looked around it with the relieved, slightly dazed expression of a person who has been moving for too long and is reminding himself what stopped looks like. He said none of that happened. He came through the door and he set his bag down neatly beside the coat rack, which Colton had never done in 20 years of coming home from anywhere. He said hello to his wife Rachel in the hallway, which was where he said it, which was not wrong exactly, just different. Hello in the hallway instead of calling from somewhere further in the house. He went to the kitchen, but he stood at the counter rather than opening the refrigerator, and he looked around the kitchen with an expression that I can only describe now as assessment, the way a person looks at a room they are learning rather than a room they already know. I said, "Were you there at the house?" He said, "I had stopped by to drop something off. I was in the kitchen when he came in. I watched the whole thing." He paused. I want to be clear that I did not understand any of this at the time. At the time, I thought he was tired, or that the trip had been harder than usual, or that something had happened out there that he was not ready to talk about yet. I gave him the thing I had brought, some equipment part he had asked me to pick up, and he took it and thanked me, and the thank you was correct, and the way he held the part was correct, and the expression on his face was correct. Everything was correct. He stopped again. That was the problem. Everything being correct is not the same as everything being right. He told me the wedding ring detail then. Colton had been married to Rachel for 14 years. The ring was a plain gold band, and it had, over 14 years, developed the specific character that worn rings develop. A slight flattening on the inner edge from constant contact with skin, a microscopic texture to the surface from being knocked against counters and steering wheels and the handles of 1,000 pieces of agricultural equipment. Grady knew this ring the way you know the rings of people you have been close to for a long time, not consciously, but in the peripheral vision of familiarity. 3 days after Colton came home, Grady was sitting across from him at dinner, and Colton reached for the salt shaker, and Grady looked at his hand, and the ring was wrong. He said, Not a different ring. The same ring. Identical, as far as I could see, as far as any casual examination would show. But the flattening was on the outer edge instead of the inner. The texture was there, but it was even like something that had been manufactured to replicate wear rather than actually worn. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds, because I spent the next 3 months telling myself how it sounded and talking to myself back from it every time. I said, "But you did not stop looking." He said, "Once you see a thing like that, it does not let you stop looking. It is like a word you have never noticed before. Once you know it, you see it everywhere." He paused. The looking is how they get you in a way, because you start looking for more and finding more, and each thing you find is small enough that any single one of them could be explained away. But together they accumulate, and the accumulation is the trap, because the accumulation is also the evidence, and you cannot stop gathering evidence once you have started, because stopping feels like agreeing to be blind. He told me the other things, the accumulation of them. The way Colton now stirred his coffee clockwise when he had always stirred it counterclockwise, a thing Grady had watched him do 10,000 times at their parents' kitchen table, and had never consciously registered until it was different. The way he laughed. Colton's laugh had always started low and built, a particular sequence Grady associated with his brother, the way he associated his brother's face or his brother's handwriting. And now the laugh started at its peak and came down, and the sequence being reversed was the kind of thing that sounded insane said aloud and was absolutely apparent to someone who had sat across from that laugh for 38 years. The way he held a pen, the way he slept. Grady said Rachel did not notice, or she noticed and could not find a frame for it, which amounts to the same thing. She told me once in November that Colton had been different since the trip, and that she was glad she could feel it, because feeling it meant she was not going crazy, but that she thought it was just the long drives catching up to him, the loneliness of that kind of travel. She called it road fatigue. She said he would settle back in. I said he did not settle back in. Grady said what settled in was not Colton. He said it quietly, with the flatness that Grady had told me earlier was the flatness of repetition rather than indifference. It had finished settling in by December, and by December it was very good. It was better than good. It was sufficient, which is worse than good in some ways because sufficient means it was no longer trying. It had what it needed, and it had stopped working for anything beyond that. The car had long since it had dawned dark. I had not noticed the light going on. Portland in February loses the day by 5 in the afternoon, and the streets go into the particular dark of a city that is still busy, but has changed its register, the lit windows going warmer, the foot traffic thinning. I was still in the parking space outside my building. My kitchen window was still lit. I said, "How did you find the organization?" He said, "The organization found me. A card on my car one morning. The same kind you have. Cream stock, heavy, just a number. I called it, like you did, and the man with the calibrated voice told me what had happened and what it would have cost Colton to prevent it, and what it was going to cost me now to do anything about it." I said, "What did he say it would cost?" Grady was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of a person deciding how much to say. He said that replacements could be reversed under certain conditions, and that the reversal process required documentation, specific documentation of the discrepancies, a formal record of every anomaly, presented to the organization in a particular format within a particular window of time. He said that the window was 6 months from the date of replacement, and that I was at 4 months, which meant I had 8 weeks remaining. I said, he said, and the documentation had to be complete. Every discrepancy, every anomaly, every wrong detail. The ring, the laugh, the pen, the sleep. All of it, written down, dated, witnessed. He paused. The organization calls it an account of seams, the places where the replacement do not quite meet the original, like a garment that has been taken apart and reassembled. The stitching is close, but if you look at the right angle in the right light, you can see where one piece ends and another begins. I said the word before I knew I was going to say it. I said, "And if you do not complete the account in time," Grady said, "then the window closed and the replacement is considered permanent and the original is—" He stopped. The word he did not say sat in the silence between us with a weight I could feel through the phone. I looked at my kitchen window. I said, "Grady, what happened to Colton?" The original Colton, while all of this was happening. He said, "That is the question I spent 6 months not asking, because not asking it was the only way I could keep doing what I needed to do." He took a breath. I finished the account. I got it in with 4 days to spare. The man with the calibrated voice told me the process had been initiated. He said I would notice a change within 72 hours. I said, "Did you?" He said, "Yes." He did not say anything further for a moment, and I did not push him, because some answers are carried in the pause that surrounds them more than in the words that eventually come. Then he said, "I need to tell you something about your situation specifically, something the man with the calibrated voice will not have told you because it is not information the organization volunteers." I said, "Tell me." He said, "The ticket appearing in your pocket was not part of their process. They do not do that. They are very clear about what they do and do not do, and that is not something they do, which means something else put it there. The kitchen window on the 2nd floor, the light was on, as it had been all evening. The ordinary amber of a room I knew in the dark, every surface, every corner, the particular geography of 11 years of ordinary life." I said, "Something else." He said, "Something that was processed, Mr. Gilman, something that is not inside their system anymore, something that found a way to use the ticket anyway, because the ticket was the only language it had left, and you were the person it needed to reach." I sat in the cold and dark of the car and looked up at my kitchen window and felt the question forming in my chest before I let it reach my mouth. I said, "Why me?" He said, "Because of what they are going to ask you to do next." I went upstairs. I want to record that plainly, because what I did after Grady's call ended was not dramatic and not brave and not the action of a person who had processed what he had just been told and arrived at a considered decision. It was the action of a person who had been sitting in a cold car for 2 hours and needed to move, needed the specific physical transaction of stairs under feet and a key in a lock and a door opening onto a known space, because the known space was the only thing available to me that still felt like a fact. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. Coffee maker, counter, the pale rectangle where the cream cart had sat for most of the previous day. The overhead light was on, the same light I had been watching from the parking lot for 2 hours, and standing inside it felt different from watching it from below. Smaller, more ordinary, the light doing the thing that light always does when you are inside it rather than looking at it from a distance, which is to illuminate rather than to suggest. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the counter and thought about everything Grady Mercer had told me. The account of seams. I had procurement experience and I had 11 years of working with documentation, and I understood in the abstract what a complete and formal record required. Specificity, chronology, witness verification, a format that left no interpretive gap. I understood the mechanics of it. What I did not understand was how a man was supposed to construct a document of that precision and that intimacy about a person who had, until 4 months ago, been his brother, and who was now something else, wearing his brother's face with sufficient accuracy that his brother's wife had called it road fatigue and gone to bed beside it every night since September. I made coffee. I did not want, and stood at the counter and thought about Stanley Roth. The ticket was still on the nightstand in the bedroom. I had not moved it since the morning. It occurred to me, standing in the kitchen with the coffee going cold in my hand, that I had been treating the ticket as a piece of evidence in a puzzle that was about me, about my name, my suit, my Tuesday, my call with the man with the calibrated voice, and that I had not yet treated it as what Grady had suggested it actually was, a message from a man who had been processed 14 days ago and who no longer had any language except the one the organization had given him before it took everything else, which was the language of tickets and garment bags and the bureaucratic machinery of claimed and unclaimed things. I went to the bedroom and picked up the ticket and brought it back to the kitchen and put it on the counter under the light and looked at it properly for the first time. Stanley Roth. The name was printed in the standard font, the same font on every ticket from that shop. Nothing distinguished about the letter forms themselves. But below the name, in the item description field, which should have said one navy suit, press only, the way mine always said whatever I had brought in, the item description said something different. It said, one navy suit, press only, and then below that in smaller type that I had taken for a printing artifact when I had first read it in the shop, a second line. The second line said, Gilman next. Check the seams. I stood in the kitchen and read it 3 times. The coffee maker clicked as it finished its cycle, and the sound was very loud in the quiet apartment, and I became aware of my own heartbeat with the sudden, unwelcome clarity that comes when the body registers something the mind is still catching up to, a full-body attention, the kind that does not ask permission. Check the seams. Grady had used that word. The account of seams, the organization's term for the document of discrepancies, the record of every place the replacement failed to meet the original. Grady had learned it from the man with the calibrated voice, who had learned it from whatever internal language the organization ran on, and it was not the kind of term that a man who had been processed 14 days ago should have known, except that Stanley Roth had worked in textile services for his entire career, according to the obituary, and textile services was an industry built on the language of fabric and fitting, and the precise assessment of where one piece met another. He had not borrowed the organization's language. The organization had borrowed him. I called Grady back. He answered the same way he had answered the first time on the first ring, with the readiness of someone who had been waiting. I read him the second line on the ticket. I read it slowly and then I read it again. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They told me the ticket could not be transferred. They told me what happened to you was outside their operational parameters." I said Stanley Roth worked in textile services. He knew the seams. Grady said, yes. I said, he knew what was coming for me before the organization contacted me. He found a way to use the ticket because it was the only thing he had that could cross whatever boundary he was on the other side of. He paused. He used it to warn you. I said, about what, specifically? The message says Gilman next. Next for what? Grady was quiet again. The careful quiet of a person organizing something they have been holding for some time and have not yet decided how to release. He said, when I finished the account of seams and submitted it and the man with a calibrated voice told me the process had been initiated, I asked him what that meant. I asked what the reversal process actually involved. He was not specific. He used language that was precise in its structure and empty in its content. The kind of language that tells you what category a thing belongs to without telling you what the thing is. He said there was a retrieval and that the retrieval required a handler, and that the handler was sourced locally. I said, what does handler mean? Grady said, I did not know then. I know now. He paused. A handler is the person the organization uses to manage the interface between the processed individual and the reversal. The retrieval does not happen without a handler. The handler has to be someone with no prior relationship to the organization, someone outside the system, someone whose involvement is clean. I said, clean. He said, untraceable, uninvolved, someone who came to the ticket by accident rather than by design. He stopped. Someone who found a wrong ticket in their pocket on a Tuesday and called the number on a cream card and talked to a man with a calibrated voice. The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee maker had stopped clicking. Outside the window, the street had gone to the late-night register, less traffic, more stillness. The particular urban silence that settles around midnight when the city is not asleep but has reduced itself to its essentials. I said, "They were going to ask me to be the handler." He said, "Yes." I said, "For your brother's reversal." He said, "That is what I did not tell you on the first call." He said it with the weight of a person who has been carrying an omission for some time and is setting it down. Colton's window was 8 weeks when the man with the calibrated voice first contacted me. I finished the account of Seams with 4 days to spare. The organization told me the process had been initiated. What they did not tell me was that initiating the process was not the same as completing it. It requires a handler. Without a handler, the process stalls. It has been stalled for 6 weeks. I said, 6 weeks. He said, the window was 4 months from the September replacement, which put the closing date at the end of January. He paused. It is now the 2nd week of February. I understood what he was telling me, and I stood in the kitchen and felt it land. The full weight of it, not as an abstraction, but as a specific and concrete fact with a specific and concrete consequence. The window had closed 6 weeks ago. The process had been waiting for a handler, and the handler had not come, and the window had closed. I said, "Grady," he said. "I know." I said, "What happens when the window closes?" He said, "The replacement is considered permanent." He said it the way he had almost said it earlier, the word beside the pause rather than in it, and the original is. He stopped again. The original is wherever processed individuals go. And after the window closes, the organization has no mechanism to reach them. No mechanism, I thought. But Stanley Roth had found one. 14 days processed, no mechanism available to him, and he had found one anyway, because he had spent a career in the language of fabric and seams and the precise, patient work of making one thing meet another without a gap showing. And he had used that language to push a pink ticket across whatever border he was standing on the other side of, into the breast pocket of a man he had never met, with 11 words printed in the item description field, below his name. Gilman next. Check the seams, not a warning about my own replacement, a warning about Colton's, about what was going to be asked of me, and about the fact that the window was already closed, and about the fact that the organization's mechanism had failed, and a dead man in a garment bag in a dry cleaning shop had decided to try a different one. I looked at the ticket on the counter. I looked at the second line. I thought about Grady Mercer sitting somewhere in this city for 6 weeks since the window closed, living with the thing wearing his brother's face across whatever table or room or ordinary shared space their lives still occupied, waiting for a process that had stalled and a handler who had not come. I said, "Tell me what a handler has to do." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Stanley Roth used the last thing he had to get a message to me. Whatever processed means, wherever he is, he spends it on this. I am not going to waste that." Grady was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, a loosening of something that had been held tightly for a very long time. He said, "It starts with the garment. It starts with the garment." I wrote the phrase down on the notepad I keep beside the coffee maker, the one I use for grocery lists and appointment reminders, and the small administrative notations of an ordinary life. And looking at it written in my own handwriting on that ordinary notepad made it feel both more real and more absurd than it had sounded in Grady's voice over the phone, which was, I was beginning to understand the consistent quality of everything connected to the situation, the gap between how it sounded and how it was. Grady talked for a long time. I let him. He said, "The organization's reversal process is built around the garment because the garment is the anchor. Every replacement begins with the garment, a specific piece of clothing belonging to the individual who is being processed, retrieved from a station, held there during the replacement, and used as what the organization calls the tether. The tether is the mechanism that keeps the processed individual locatable. Without the tether, the retrieval has no coordinates. Without coordinates, there is no reversal. I said, Colton's tether. What garment? He said, a work jacket. Canvas, dark green, the one he wore on every Eastern run for the past 6 years. He dropped it at Veterans Dry Cleaning in late August, 2 weeks before the trip, because the lining had torn and he wanted it repaired before the season got cold. He picked it up. Or something picked it up in his shape, already by that point, on the Thursday before he left. I said, so the jacket went with whatever replaced him. Grady said, that is what the organization told me, yes. The tether travels with the replacement during the active phase, and then when the replacement has fully settled, the tether is returned to the station. Mrs. Gable has been holding it since mid-October. I thought about the rows of pale garment bags in Alderman's, which had been Veterans before it was Alderman's, which had been Gerald and Stanley Roth's before it was Gerald's alone. I thought about Grady's word, tether, and about what it meant to be held in place by a piece of fabric, located by the specific coordinates of a canvas work jacket with a repaired lining, suspended in whatever space processed individuals occupied while the window was open, and the handler had not come, and the weeks had counted down to the closing date and past it. I said, what does a handler do with the garment? He said, the handler retrieves it from the station. Physically, in person, with a ticket. He paused. There is always a ticket. The ticket is how the organization tracks the transaction. Without the ticket, the station manager cannot release the garment. The organization issues the ticket to the handler as part of the formal engagement, which is what the contact call initiates. The man with the calibrated voice, the cream card, the number, that is the beginning of formal engagement. The ticket comes after. I said, but the window is closed. He said, yes. I said, so the formal engagement cannot be initiated. The organization has no mechanism. The ticket cannot be issued. He was quiet. I looked at the pink ticket on the counter, Stanley Roth's ticket, with his name printed in standard font, and below it, in smaller type, 11 words that had crossed a border they should not have been able to cross. I said, Grady, what if there is already a ticket? The silence on the line had a different quality than the silences before it. Not the quiet of a person organizing their thoughts, the quiet of a person who has just felt something shift. He said, say that again. I read him the item description field in full. 1 navy suit, press only. And then the second line. Gilman next. Check the seams. He said, the seams. He said it slowly, turning it in his mouth. You said Stanley Roth worked in textile services. I said, his whole career. He and Gerald ran the shop together before Gerald ran it alone. Grady said, then he knew the process from the inside. He would have known what a tether was. He would have known what the account of seams was and what the window meant and what stalls a retrieval. He paused, and I could hear him thinking, the specific breathing of a person following something to its end. And he would have known that a ticket is a ticket regardless of how it was issued. The station manager accepts the ticket. The transaction is completed. The garment is released. I said, a ticket issued by a processed individual rather than by the organization. He said, it should not be possible. I said, he was in textile services for 30 years. He knew more about what holds things together than the organization gave him credit for. Another silence. Then Grady said, very carefully, the way a person says something they are not yet certain. They are allowed to hope. You are saying Stanley Roth issued you his ticket, not as a warning, as the instrument. I said, he said Gilman next. Not Gilman is next in line to be processed. Gilman is the next handler. He put the ticket in my pocket because the ticket is the credential. He spent whatever he had left to create a handler the organization did not make, because the organization's mechanism had failed, and he could see, from wherever he was, with whatever remained available to him, that Colton Mercer's window was closing, and no one was coming. Grady's breathing had changed. I noticed it the way you notice a shift in the sound of a room. Not dramatic, not sudden, but present and real. He said, "Then you have to go to the station." I said, "I know." He said, "Mrs. Gable will know the ticket is not from the organization. She will know it immediately. She has been a station manager for 19 years. She will know every ticket the organization has ever issued, and yours will not match." I said. She gave me the card rather than the alternative. You told me what that meant. She assessed me and made a choice. She's been holding Colton's jacket since October, and she watched the window close and she gave me the card anyway. A long pause. The longest of the night. Then Grady said, "She knew. When she gave you the card, she already knew the organization's mechanism had stalled. She knew you were not a standard contact. She gave you the card because she was hoping you were doing something else." I said, "She was hoping Stanley had found a way." I went to Veterans Dry Cleaning the next morning. I want to describe the walk from my car to the door, because I have been trying to write this account with the precision it deserves, and that walk is one of the parts I keep glossing over, and the glossing is dishonest. It was a 4-minute walk on a February morning, cold, the sky the specific gray of Portland in the second month of the year, and I covered the distance the way a person covers distance when they're trying not to think about what is at the end of it, which is to say by thinking about everything else available. The sound of my shoes on the pavement, the temperature of the air, the smell of coffee from a cart on the corner, the ordinary sensory inventory of a city going about its morning. The door was unlocked. The sign said closed, but the door stopped when I pushed it. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter. She was not pressing anything. She was standing with her hands folded on the counter surface and her eyes on the door. And when I came through it, she looked at me with an expression I recognized from 2 days before, except that the resigned quality in it had been replaced by something else, something closer to relief, which on her face looked almost identical to grief. The two expressions sharing so much of the same architecture that only the eyes made the distinction. I put the pink ticket on the counter. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. She read the item description field, both lines slowly. Then she said, "He found a way." I said he knew the seams. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she reached below the counter and produced a claim form and a pen and placed them beside the ticket. And she went to the motorized rack and entered a number I could not see from where I was standing. And the rack began to move, the pale garment bags shifting in their slow carousel until it stopped at a bag near the middle of the row. She unhooked it and brought it to the counter. Dark green canvas visible through the clear lower portion of the bag. A work jacket, well used, with the particular worn quality of a garment that has been somewhere real. The lining, I could see at the hem, had been repaired with careful, even stitching. She said, "You will need to take it to him directly, not to the organization, directly to Grady Mercer, and Grady Mercer will need to place it in contact with the replacement. Physical contact. The tether works in both directions. It is how the replacement is anchored, and it is how the anchor is lifted." I said, "What happens when the anchor is lifted?" She said, "The replacement releases." She paused. "It does not do so willingly. You should know that before you go." I said, "In Colton." She looked at the jacket in the bag on the counter. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been keeping safe for a long time and are now finally released into its proper use. She said, "The tether is still active. The window closes for the organization because the organization has mechanisms and mechanisms have limits." She met my eyes. Stanley did not have mechanisms. He had knowledge and he had a ticket and he had enough of whatever remains available to a processed individual to find the one person in this city who would walk through that door this morning. She slid the jacket across the counter. She said, "The window the organization uses is not the only window there is." I picked up the jacket. It was heavier than I expected. with the specific weight of a garment that has been somewhere and done something and carries the record of it in its fabric, the way all worn things do. Quietly, without announcement, I said, "Mrs. Gable, how long have you been doing this?" She looked past me at the door, at the gray February street beyond the glass, and her expression settled back into the stillness I had first seen 2 days ago. The stillness of a person who has been keeping something for a very long time and has learned to wear the keeping lightly. She sat long enough to know when a ticket is real. She turned and went back to the rack without saying anything further, and the motorized mechanism started up, and the garment bags began their slow and patient rotation, and I left the shop with Colton Mercer's work jacket under my arm, and Stanley Roth's ticket in my pocket, and the February cold finding every seam of my coat with its quiet and thorough attention. Grady Mercer lived in a duplex in the Woodstock neighborhood, southeast Portland, a part of the city that has the particular quality of a place that has been almost changed many times and has absorbed each almost without quite becoming something different. The coffee shops and the hardware stores and the houses with their deep front porches existing in the specific equilibrium of a neighborhood that knows what it is and has decided to remain it. I had the address from the second call. I had not been to the neighborhood before, and I navigated by phone, the jacket in its garment bag laid across the back seat, and I was aware of it back there the entire drive in the way you are aware of a passenger who is not making any sound, a peripheral presence that changes the quality of the air in the car without doing anything specific to cause the change. The drive took 19 minutes. I know this because I watched the time with the attention of a person who needs something concrete to track when everything else has become difficult to hold. Grady answered the door before I knocked. He had been watching from the window, which I understood without needing to be told, because it was what I would have done. He was in his early 40s, solidly built, with the look of someone who had been sleeping poorly for long enough that it had settled into the architecture of his face. Not dramatic, not haggard, just a specific kind of tiredness that had become structural rather than temporary. He looked at the garment bag over my arm, and something in his expression moved, briefly, before he controlled it. He said, "Come in." The house was warm and orderly in the way of a person who manages anxiety through organization, every surface clear, every object in a considered position. There was coffee on the counter. There was a window over the kitchen sink that looked out onto a narrow backyard where a wooden table sat in the February gray, with 2 chairs pushed neatly under it. He poured coffee without asking, and set it in front of me, and sat across the table and looked at the garment bag, which I had placed on the chair beside me. I told him everything Mrs. Gable had said, the tether working in both directions, the physical contact, the replacement releasing. I told him what she had said about the window and about Stanley, and I watched his face while I told him, the careful, controlled attention of a man who has been waiting for this information for 6 weeks and is now receiving it and is not yet certain he is allowed to believe it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where is Colton now?" "The replacement." I said, "You tell me. You have been living alongside it for 5 months. He said, "It keeps the schedule." He paused, and I could hear the effort it cost him to use the pronoun, the small daily violence of referring to something wearing his brother's face as it, and also the necessity of it, the way the necessity had become its own kind of discipline. Colton's route this time of year runs east on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today is Thursday. It left at 6 this morning. It will be back by 4 this afternoon. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was 9:47. We had 6 hours and change, which felt like either enough or nowhere near enough, depending on which part of what we were about to do I focused on. I said, "Tell me exactly what 5 months of watching it has shown you. Every anomaly, every seam. I need to understand what I am going to be in the room with when it comes back." He told me. He talked for the better part of an hour, and I listened the way I listen when the information matters, which is without interrupting, without editorializing. without the small affirmatory sounds people make when they are following a story. I just let it come. He told me about the ring and the laugh and the pen and the sleep, which he had described on the phone. And then he told me the things he had not described on the phone, the things he had been saving. I understood, for a person who was actually going to do something with them rather than simply receive them as testimony. He told me that the replacement ate differently, not wrongly. It ate what Colton ate, in the quantities Colton ate, at the times Colton ate, and if you were watching from across a table and not looking for anything specific, you would not have noticed. But Grady had been looking for everything specific for 5 months, and what he had noticed was that the replacement ate without sequence. Colton had always had a sequence. Protein first, then vegetables, then whatever starch was on the plate, a habit so ingrained he had never been aware of it. A thing Grady had noticed only in childhood, and then forgotten until it was gone. The replacement ate in no particular order. It worked through the plate with the systematic efficiency of something completing a task rather than the unconscious preference of a person eating a meal. He told me that the replacement did not dream. Rachel had mentioned this in November, not as something alarming, just as an observation, that Colton had stopped talking in his sleep, which he had done their entire marriage, short fragments, not words exactly, more like the sounds of someone working through something in a language that only partially overlapped with spoken English. She had found it endearing, then missed it, then decided it meant he was sleeping more peacefully. Grady had written it down the day she mentioned it and had not told her what he thought it meant. He told me about the photograph. There was a photograph on the mantel in the living room of the duplex, a picture from a camping trip 4 years ago. Grady and Colton and 2 friends at a trailhead in the Columbia River Gorge, all 4 of them squinting into the sun with the expressions of people who have been walking uphill for several hours and are satisfied about it. Grady had looked at that photograph every time he had been in Colton's house for 4 years without consciously looking at it. The way you do not look at photographs you know well. They simply exist in the peripheral field of a familiar room. In December he had looked at it directly for the first time in months, and he had noticed that the replacement looked at it differently from the way Colton had looked at it. Colton had glanced at it the way you glance at a thing that belongs to your own history, with a kind of proprietary and slightly embarrassed familiarity. The replacement looked at it with the focused attention of a person studying a document, taking in information, cross-referencing it with something internal. It looked at it like research. Grady said, "That was when I stopped being uncertain. You can explain the ring and the laugh and the sleep. You can tell yourself you are projecting. You can spend weeks negotiating with your own perception. But watching something look at a photograph of your brother's life as if it is memorizing the terms of a contract, that is not something you can explain away." "That is a seam," I said, "when it comes back this afternoon. Where will it go first?" He said, "Kitchen. It makes coffee when it comes in from a run, before it does anything else." Colton always made coffee when he came home, so the replacement makes coffee. It does not drink it the same way. Colton drank it standing at the counter, and the replacement sits, which is a small thing, and the kind of small thing that sounds meaningless until you've watched it happen every single time for 5 months and you understand that small things done consistently are how you build a life, and small things done wrongly are how you reveal that you are building a copy of one. I said, "So, it will be in the kitchen, with its back to the door." He looked at me. I said, "I need to be in the house before it comes back. I need to be somewhere. It will not immediately see me, somewhere where I can close the distance quickly once it is occupied." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Rachel will not be home. She works Thursdays until 6. I said, "Then it will be alone in the kitchen, and we will come through the back." He looked at the table, at the surface of it, at his own hands flat on the wood. He was doing what I'd watched him do throughout the morning, the quiet internal work of a person bringing themselves to a thing they have been waiting for and are now frightened of in a different way than they were frightened of the waiting, because the waiting is familiar and the thing itself is not. He said, "If it does not release." I said. Mrs. Gable said the tether works in both directions. She did not say it was guaranteed. He said no. I said she said it does not release willingly. He said no. We sat with that for a moment, the full weight of it distributed evenly across the table between us, neither of us putting it down. Then Grady stood and picked up his coffee cup and rinsed it at the sink and set it in the drying rack with the care of a person completing a small ordinary task before a large extraordinary one. And he looked out the window at the 2 chairs under the wooden table in the narrow gray backyard. He said, Colton bought that table. 3rd summer they were in the house. He drove 40 minutes to an estate sale in Milwaukee to get it because Rachel had seen one like it in a magazine and mentioned it once, in passing, the way you mention things you do not expect to receive. He paused. He did not tell her where he got it. He just carried it through the back gate one Saturday morning and set it up and called her outside. She cried. He was embarrassed about it for years. He looked at the table for a long moment. He said, that is the Colton I am going to this house to retrieve. Not a concept. That specific man who drove 40 minutes to Milwaukee because his wife mentioned a table once. I picked up the garment bag from the chair. I said, then let us go and get him. We left through Grady's front door into the February gray, and the street was ordinary, and the sky was the color it always was. At this time of year, and the city was conducting its Thursday business with the complete indifference of a city that does not know, and does not need to know what is happening inside any given house on any given street within its boundaries. And we walked to my car, and I put the garment bag in the back seat, and we drove toward Colton Mercer's house through the quiet residential blocks of southeast Portland. And I thought about Stanley Roth, who had spent a career learning the language of what holds things together, and had used the last of what he had to push a ticket across a border that should not have been crossable. And I thought about Mrs. Gable saying the window the organization uses is not the only window there is, and I thought about what it means to be located by a tether, to be held in coordinates by a piece of fabric, to be findable because something of yours is still in the world, waiting to be claimed. The garment bag was in the back seat. The ticket was in my pocket. We drove. Colton Mercer's house was a craftsman bungalow on a street of craftsman bungalows, the kind of block that Portland produces in its southeast quadrant with a comfortable regularity of a neighborhood that settled into its aesthetic 100 years ago and has not seen a reason to revise it since. Deep front porches, mature street trees, the particular patina of houses that have been inhabited continuously and carefully for generations. We parked 2 blocks away. I want to record why. Because it was Grady's decision, and the reasoning behind it was precise and considered in the way that all of Grady's decisions had been precise and considered throughout the morning. The quality of a man who had spent 5 months in a state of sustained and careful attention and had developed, in that time, a kind of tactical clarity that I recognized from my own professional experience with complex logistics. The ability to see a situation not as a single event but as a sequence of interdependent movements, each one contingent on the one before. He said, it parks in the same spot every time. Left side of the driveway, close to the fence. When it comes in from the eastern run, it is tired in the way the replacement gets tired, which is different from the way Colton got tired. Colton came home loose, unwound by the drive. The particular relaxed quality of a man who processes thought through movement and arrives home having finished processing. The replacement comes home tighter than it left, as if the effort of sustaining the performance across a full day in the field costs something it has to spend and then recover. It goes directly to the kitchen. It makes the coffee. For approximately the first 12 minutes, it is home, it is occupied, and its back is to the yard. I said, you have timed it. He said, I have timed it 6 times over 5 months on the days I had reason to be in the house when it returned. 11 minutes is the shortest. 14 is the longest. 12 is the average. We had the back gate key from Grady's keyring. A spare Rachel had given him years ago for the occasions when they needed someone to let in a delivery or check on the house when they traveled. We went around the block and came in through the alley and let ourselves through the gate quietly, and the backyard received us with the specific silence of a private space in winter. The wooden table and its 2 chairs gray and damp in the middle of the dead grass. The fence on 3 sides blocking the street, sound so that the yard existed in its own acoustic pocket, muffled and still. We stood at the back of the yard and waited. I had the garment bag over my arm. The canvas jacket inside it was invisible through the opaque upper portion of the bag, and I kept my hand on it the way you keep a hand on something you are responsible for, not gripping, just present, maintaining contact. The bag was cold from the outside air, and the cold came through the plastic and into my palm, and I let it, because the cold was real and specific, and I needed real and specific things around me in that moment. At 3:58, we heard the car. The sound of it pulling into the driveway on the far side of the house, the engine cutting, a door, footsteps on the porch, the front door opening and closing, then silence. Then, after a moment that felt longer than it probably was, the sound of the kitchen coming alive. A cabinet, the particular mechanical sound of a coffee maker being filled, water running briefly and then stopping. Grady looked at me. I said nothing. I nodded once. We crossed the yard. The back door was unlocked, which Grady had told me it would be. Colton had never locked the back door during the day. A habit of a man who had grown up in a house where the back door was a different category of entrance than the front, more informal, more continuously in use, and the replacement had preserved the habit because the replacement preserved everything it had observed, everything that could be documented and replicated, every behavior that existed in the record of Colton Mercer's daily life that could be watched and learned and reproduced with sufficient accuracy to pass. It was the things that could not be watched that it had gotten wrong. The sequence on the plate. The talking in sleep, the way you look at a photograph of your own history versus the way you look at research. The way love sits in the body differently from the performance of love. And the small and unconscious things, the unstudied habits. The table from Milwaukee carried through the back gate on a Saturday morning because a person who loves someone pays attention to what they mention once in passing and does not forget it, and does not make a production of remembering it either, just acts, quietly, in the specific and irreplaceable language of someone who has been paying attention for a long time. The replacement had not loved Rachel. It had performed loving Rachel with considerable precision, but performance and presence are not the same thing, and the seams between them, if you knew where to look and had 5 months to look, were findable. We came through the back door into the mudroom and then to the kitchen. It was standing at the counter with its back to us, exactly as Grady had described, the coffee maker running, its hands flat on the counter on either side of it, in the posture of a person waiting for something to finish. It was wearing Colton's clothes, work pants, a fleece, the ordinary end-of-day presentation of a man who has been driving since 6 in the morning and has not yet changed. The back of its head was Colton's head. The set of its shoulders was Colton's shoulders. The specific geography of a body is among the most intimate knowledge one person carries about another. And standing in the kitchen doorway looking at the back of it, I understood why Grady had been able to go on telling himself, for as long as he had, that this was still his brother. Because from behind, in a kitchen at the end of a Thursday, it was close enough to break your heart. It hurt us. Not immediately. We had been quiet. But after a moment, some peripheral awareness shifted and the shoulders changed slightly, and it began to turn, and that was when Grady moved. He was faster than I expected. Not violent, not dramatic. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and he had its arm, and I was already unzipping the garment bag. The sound of the zipper very loud in the kitchen. Quiet, and the replacement turned fully, and I saw its face. I'm going to be honest about what I saw, because the honesty is the point of this account, and I have been honest about everything else. It was Colton's face, every particular part of it, the jaw, the eyes, the specific arrangement of features that Grady had looked at across tables and in photographs and through the windshields of cars for 38 years. It looked at me with Colton's eyes, and in those eyes there was something that was not Colton, a quality of assessment, a cold and rapid calculation that the face around it was not built to contain, the seam between what the face was and what was using it suddenly and completely visible. I looked at the jacket in my hands. Its expression did not change. Expressions were within its competence, but something in the posture shifted, a bracing, a preparation, and it said in Colton's voice, "You should not have that." Grady tightened his grip on its arm, and I stepped forward and pressed the jacket against its chest, the canvas of it flat against the fleece it was wearing, and held it there with both hands. For a moment nothing happened. The coffee maker finished its cycle. The sound of it, the click and the small exhalation of steam, was very loud in the silence of the kitchen. Then something changed in the air. I do not have a better description than that. The air in the kitchen changed its quality. The way air changes before a storm, a pressure shift, a density, something gathering and then releasing. And the replacement made a sound that I will not try to transcribe because the sound did not belong to Colton's voice, and I do not want to give it more space in this account than it deserves. And then it was not braced anymore. It was simply standing, and Grady was holding his brother's arm, and the face was still Colton's face, but the thing behind the eyes that had been doing its cold calculation was gone. And what was there instead was something I recognized immediately, and could not have named until I saw it, which was the specific and disoriented presence of a person returning to a room they did not know they had left. Colton looked at Grady. He said, "What?" His voice was Colton's voice entirely now. The sequence of it right, the register right, the particular sound of a man who is confused and is not yet frightened because he does not yet know how much has happened while he was away. He said, "Grady, what are you doing in my kitchen?" Grady did not say anything. He put both arms around his brother and held on, and the jacket was between them, pressed flat. And I stepped back and let them have the space and turned toward the back door and the yard and the gray February afternoon beyond the glass. The two chairs were under the wooden table. The table from Milwaukee. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it and thought about Stanley Roth, who had carried his knowledge of seams and tethers and the language of what holds things together into whatever space processed individuals occupy, and had used it to find a window the organization did not know was there, and had pushed a pink ticket through it with 11 words in the item description field, and whatever remained of his patience and his precision and his professional understanding of how one piece meets another when the stitching is done right. Behind me, Grady was talking to his brother in a low voice, the voice you use when you are telling someone something enormous and you are trying to give it to them in pieces small enough to hold. I took the garment bag and folded it under my arm and let myself out through the back door into the yard and pulled the door closed behind me and stood in the cold with the wooden table and the two chairs and the dead winter grass. And I breathed the February air which smelled of damp wood and distant rain and the very faint chemical suggestion of the city processing its own ordinary life all around me. And I felt the specific and quiet completion of a thing that has been asked of you, and that you have done. The ticket was still in my coat pocket. I took it out and looked at it one last time. Stanley Roth. One navy suit, press only. Gilman next. Check the seams. I folded it carefully along its existing crease and held it for a moment, and then I set it on the table, on the surface of the wood from Milwaukee, under the gray Portland sky, and I left it there, and walked back through the gate into the alley and back around the block to my car. The drive back to my apartment took 23 minutes. I know because I watched the time again, the same way I had watched it in the morning, and for the same reason. Because I needed something concrete and measurable to hold while everything else was still settling into its new arrangement. I parked outside my building and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. My kitchen window was lit. I had left the light on when I left that morning, the way I had been leaving it since the Tuesday with the wrong ticket. and the light was doing what light does from a distance, which is to make a space look inhabited and warm and waiting, which is what a lit window promises from the street, even when the room inside is empty, and the promise is technically incorrect. I had been thinking, on the drive, about Stanley Roth and Veterans Dry Cleaning, dropping off his good suit on a Tuesday with a Friday work function in mind, something he needed to settle, someone he needed to see face to face, and then dying on Wednesday with the ticket still in his pocket and the intention still intact, and whatever he had needed to say still unsaid. I thought about what it cost to leave things unfinished. I thought about the difference between a window closing and a window being found by someone who knows where to look and has the right tool in their hand and enough left in them to use it. I got out of the car and went upstairs and stood in my kitchen and looked at the pale rectangle on the counter where the cream cart had been, and then I made coffee and drank it standing up, the way I always had, and the solvent smell from aldermans came up through the floor, faint and chemical and real, and I let it, because it was part of the building I lived in, and the building I lived in was part of the city I lived in, and the city was going about its business all around me with its complete and beautiful indifference, and I was inside it, ordinary and located and entirely myself, which was not a thing I would ever again take for granted. On the notepad by the coffee maker, below where I had written "It starts with the garment," I wrote one more line. It ends with the ticket. I left the notepad where it was and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. And for the first time in a week, I slept without waking. And in the morning, the city was still there, gray and wet and fully itself, and so was I.